Why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. Welcome, dear listener. As you lay there, your body cushioned by your bed, the soft glow of the moonlight slipping through the curtains, let your mind wander into the realm of history. Tonight, we're going to embark on a journey back in time to an era of knights and castles, of lords and serfs. It was a time of both intense hardship and remarkable innovation, a time that has captivated the human imagination for centuries. This is the time of the Middle Ages, and tonight we will explore why you, a modern individual, would find it almost impossible to last a single day in this era. The Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period, spanned from the 5th to the 15th century. It started with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and merged into the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. To set the scene, imagine a landscape dotted with grand castles, their stone walls standing tall against the backdrop of the sky. Picture villages of thatched-roof cottages, their chimneys puffing out smoke. See the people, the nobles in their fine silks, the peasants in their simple clothes, the monks in their solemn robes. Hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cows, the bustle of the market. However, life in this era was far from the romanticized version we often see in movies or read in books. It was, in fact, a period characterized by great struggle and adversity. The average life expectancy was around 30 years, and a vast majority of the populace lived in abject poverty. Sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and the threat of war was an ever-present reality. One of the most striking differences between our time and the Middle Ages is the lack of modern conveniences that we take for granted. Imagine a life without electricity, without running water, without central heating. In the winter, you would have to rely on a fireplace for heat, with the risk of the fire going out in the middle of the night. In the summer, there was no escape from the heat and the swarms of insects that came with it. You might think that the simple act of eating would be a respite from these hardships, but even this was fraught with difficulty. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. The diet of the average peasant was limited to bread, vegetables, and a little dairy. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even if you were lucky enough to get your hands on some, there were no refrigerators to keep it fresh. Food poisoning was a common occurrence and could easily prove fatal. Water, too, was not as readily available as it is today. Wells were the primary source of drinking water, but these were often contaminated. As a result, people frequently drank ale or beer, as the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria. However, this led to a whole other set of problems. As excessive drinking was common, hygiene was another area in which medieval times vastly differed from today. Bathing was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. In fact, it was believed that bathing opened the pores to disease, and so was avoided when possible. As a result, people often had lice, fleas, and other parasites. The lack of dental care meant that tooth decay was rampant, and the solution was usually extraction without any form of anesthesia. Medicine, too, was a far cry from what we know today. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and disease, and their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common practice based on the belief that it could balance the body's humors. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, and the mortality rate was extremely high. Let's continue our journey through medieval times with a closer look at the living conditions. If you're fond of modern amenities like running water, electricity, or even just a comfortable bed, medieval times would have been a shock to your system. Houses during this era were usually made of a wooden frame filled with wl and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with straw, which provided a modicum of insulation. However, the walls were thin, and the homes lacked any real heating source, making winters bitterly cold. Fireplaces were a luxury that few could afford, so most people huddled around a central hearth for warmth. The smoke from this open fire had to escape from a hole in the roof, which meant that the interior of the home was often choked with smoke. Imagine trying to find comfort in such a setting, huddled with your family members, your eyes stinging from the smoke. Most homes consisted of a single room that served multiple purposes. The same room that was used for cooking and eating was also the sleeping quarters. Privacy was a concept virtually unheard of, as entire families would sleep together in the same space, often on a single bed of straw. If you found the idea of sharing a bedroom with a sibling frustrating as a child, imagine sharing a bed with your entire family. Sanitation, or rather the lack of it, would be another shock to the modern system. There were no bathrooms as we know them. Instead, people would use chamber pots, which were emptied out of windows and onto the streets below. The waste would then run down the streets and into the local rivers, which were also the primary sources of drinking water. The result was rampant disease. From dysentery to the plague, the smell alone would be enough to make the strongest stomachs churn. This brings us to the topic of personal hygiene. The idea of daily showers would have been unimaginable to the people of the Middle Ages. Most people bathed rarely, and when they did, it was often in the local river or a community bath house. These bathhouses, while providing a place for communal bathing, were also a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. There was a prevalent belief during this time that bathing opened the pores to disease. So many people chose to bathe as infrequently as possible. This meant that people often carried a strong odor, which was only masked by the use of herbs and flowers. Food in the Middle Ages was also a far cry from what we're accustomed to today. The average person's diet consisted of bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was a luxury that few could afford, and fresh fruits and vegetables were not a common part of the diet. Malnutrition was a common problem, as the diet lacked many essential vitamins and nutrients. It wasn't all hardship and struggle, however. There were moments of joy and celebration, often centered around religious holidays and feasts. Music and dance were important parts of medieval culture, providing a much-needed escape from the harsh realities of daily life. People would gather in the village square to dance, sing, and celebrate. Even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to shine through. So, as we close this chapter, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modern life. The next time you take a hot shower, sleep in a warm bed, or enjoy a fresh, healthy meal, remember how far we've come. The Middle Ages may have been a time of great cultural and intellectual growth, but they were also a time of hardship and struggle. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that we've come so far. In our next section, we'll dive deeper into the social structure of the Middle Ages, exploring the roles of the king, nobles, knights, and peasants. Stay tuned and let the soothing rhythm of history lull you into a peaceful slumber. As the sun creeps over the horizon, our medieval day begins. Life in the Middle Ages was dictated by the sun. It determined when you woke, when you worked, and when you slept. In a world without electricity, daylight was precious, and every ray of sun had to be used for vital chores and tasks. If you're imagining the luxury of a lazy Sunday morning, think again. The medieval folk were early risers, typically getting up at the crack of dawn, as signaled by the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of the local church bell. Once out of bed, people would dress in simple tunics made of coarse wool, linen, or hemp, depending on their wealth and status. The wealthy might have clothes dyed in brighter colors and made of finer materials, but the majority wore drab, practical clothing, not unlike the sackcloth of biblical fame. Shoes were a luxury, with most peasants going barefoot, especially in the warmer months. The first meal of the day was breakfast. But this was not the feast of bacon, eggs, and toast that we're accustomed to. Medieval breakfast was a frugal affair, often consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and if they were lucky, a bit of cold meat or fish from the previous night's meal. This would be washed down with a mug of ale, or for the wealthier folk, wine. Yes, you heard that right. Water was often unsafe to drink due to poor sanitation. So low alcohol ale and wine were common beverages even for children. After breakfast, it was straight to work. The majority of medieval people were peasants working the land for the local lord. Their days were filled with hard physical labor, plowing fields, sowing seeds, tending animals, and harvesting crops. Even children were expected to contribute with tasks appropriate to their age and strength. The work was backbreaking and the hours were long. From dawn until dusk, the fields and pastures were a hive of activity with only a short break at midday for a meal and rest. If you were lucky enough to be a craftsman, your day might involve working in a shop or at a market stall, selling your wares. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and weavers were all critical to the medieval economy. Their skills were in high demand, and their products, horseshoes, bread, furniture, and cloth, were essential for daily life. However, these jobs were not without their hardships. The work was often dangerous with the risk of injury or even death from accidents or fires. In contrast, the life of a noble or a knight was very different. They did not labor in the fields, but they were busy with their own duties and responsibilities. They had to manage their estates, administer justice, train for war, and engage in politics. The noble's day was filled with meetings, decisions, and paperwork, much like a modern CEO. As the sun began to set, the day's work would come to an end. Supper was the main meal of the day, usually consisting of a hearty stew made of meat, vegetables, and grains. The wealthier you were, the more varied and extravagant your diet would be. The rich feasted on roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries washed down with fine wines. After supper, people would gather around the hearth for a few hours of relaxation before bed. They might tell stories, play simple games, or just enjoy the warmth and companionship of their family and friends. Then, as the last embers in the hearth died out, it was time for bed. Beds were simple affairs, often just a pile of straw covered with a blanket. Only the wealthy had the luxury of a wooden bedstead, stuffed mattress, and feather pillows. As you lay down to sleep, you would be aware of the silence broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. There were no street lights, no cars, no electric hum, just the dark and the quiet. And with that, your day in medieval times would come to an end, ready to start again with the crowing of the rooster at dawn. So as you settle into your comfortable modern bed tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors. Their lives were hard and their comforts were few, but they made the best of what they had. They worked, they laughed, they loved, and they slept just like we do. They were in essence just like us, only their world was a very different place. As we delve deeper into the details of medieval life, we find ourselves standing in the middle of a bustling medieval marketplace, a sensory overload of sights, sounds, and smells. The marketplace was the economic center of medieval society, a place where merchants and craftsmen came to sell their wares, and where peasants came to purchase the essential goods they needed for survival. Imagine the cacophony of vendors hawking their wares, the clatter of carts and the lowing of livestock, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the baker's stall, and the less pleasant stench of unwashed people and animals. Goods would have included everything from foodstuffs like bread, cheese, and vegetables, to manufactured items like clothing, household goods, and tools. It's worth noting that in these times, currency wasn't as prevalent as it is today. Bartering was a common practice, and goods would often be exchanged for other goods or services. So if you were a craftsperson, you might trade a handcrafted tool for a sack of grain or a pair of shoes. Food, of course, was a critical part of daily life in the Middle Ages. Contrary to popular belief, medieval food was not all gr and stale bread. The diet of an average person in the Middle Ages would have revolved around grains such as barley, oats, rye, and wheat. Bread, porridge, and ale made from these grains would have been staples. Vegetables like cabbages, onions, garlic, and leeks were common, as were fruits like apples, pears, and berries. Meat and fish were also consumed, but less frequently, typically reserved for those of higher social status or for special occasions. Now imagine the water you drink and the food you eat being prepared in medieval conditions. There was no knowledge of bacteria and the role they played in causing disease. Water was often taken straight from rivers or wells, which could be contaminated with human and animal waste. Food was often stored in unsanitary conditions, and there was no refrigeration. This led to frequent outbreaks of diseases like dysentery and cholera. In addition to the marketplace, the other bustling center of activity, the medieval village, would have been the manor, home to the local lord. The lord was the most powerful person in the village, responsible for maintaining law and order, administering justice, and protecting the villagers from outside threats. In return, the villagers were expected to work the lord's lands and pay him rent in the form of goods or services. The manor house itself would have been a large fortified structure, often surrounded by a moat for protection. Inside you would find a great hall where the lord would hold court, a chapel for religious services, and private chambers for the lord and his family. Despite the grandeur of the manor house, life inside was not luxurious by modern standards. There was no indoor plumbing, and heating was provided by large smoky fires. The lord's power was not absolute. However, he was subject to the king, who held ultimate authority. The relationship between the lord and the king was based on a system of mutual obligations known as feudalism. The lord pledged his loyalty to the king and provided him with military service when needed. In return, the king granted the lord lands and rights over the people who lived on them. This feudal system was a fundamental aspect of medieval society, creating a hierarchy of power and privilege. At the top were the king and the nobility, who owned the land and controlled the wealth. Below them were the knights, who provided military service in exchange for land and status. At the bottom were the peasants, who worked the land and had few rights or freedoms. In the next section, we will explore the harsh reality of medieval warfare and the role of knights in society. But for now, let's take a moment to reflect on the fact that this was a time when survival was a daily struggle, and the creature comforts we enjoy today were inconceivable luxuries. As we drift off into a peaceful sleep, let's appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern lives and the progress that has been made over the centuries. In the end, the Middle Ages were a time of great hardship and adversity, but also a time of remarkable resilience and innovation. Life was difficult, but people found ways to adapt and survive, to create beauty and meaning in the midst of their challenges. And that perhaps is the most enduring lesson of the Middle Ages, the capacity of the human spirit to endure and to flourish even in the harshest of circumstances. So as we close our eyes and surrender to the soothing embrace of sleep, let's carry that thought with us into our dreams, a reminder of the strength and resilience that resides within each of us. As we delve deeper into the daily life of the medieval period, it's important to note that the rhythm of the day was very different than the one we are used to in our modern times. It was a time when the sun served as the main indicator of the time, and the need for survival necessitated early rising. A typical day would start at dawn with a quick meal known as breakfast, a term borrowed from the Old English breakfasta, which literally means to break the night's fast. This meal was usually a simple affair, consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and perhaps a cup of ale. Following breakfast, the majority of the day was dedicated to work. The type of work varied greatly, depending on one's social status. If you were a peasant, your day would be filled with grueling physical labor. Medieval peasants were essentially farmers and worked the land to produce the food that was required to feed the entire kingdom. They planted and harvested crops, raised livestock, and did whatever else was necessary to maintain the estate they lived on. If you were born into the nobility, your day would look very different. While nobles did not have to perform physical labor, they were responsible for managing the land and the people who lived on it. They made important decisions about when to plant and harvest crops, how to distribute resources, and how to defend their land in the event of a conflict. This was no easy task and required a great deal of strategic thinking and interpersonal skills. The middle class, which consisted of merchants and craftsmen, also had their own set of responsibilities. A merchant's day might be spent acquiring goods and then selling them in the market. They would have to keep track of their inventory, negotiate prices, and navigate the complex world of medieval trade. Craftsmen, on the other hand, would spend their days creating the goods that were sold in the market. They would have to master their craft, whether it was blacksmithing, weaving, or carpentry, and produce high-quality products that would sell well. Lunch, the main meal of the day, was taken around midday. This was a more substantial meal than breakfast, and typically consisted of several courses. Bread was still the staple, but it would be accompanied by meat or fish, vegetables, and a variety of sauces and spices. The meal would be washed down with ale or wine, as water was often unsafe to drink. After lunch, work would resume until dusk. The evening meal was similar to breakfast, a simple and quick affair. After this, people would retire to their beds. There was no concept of leisure time as we know it today. Free time was a luxury that very few people could afford. The medieval period was a time of hard work and simplicity. Life was dictated by the seasons and the demands of survival. But despite its hardships, it was also a time of community and shared responsibility. People relied on each other for survival and worked together to ensure the well-being of their community. It was a time when the line between life and death was often thinned, but it was also a time when people truly lived in the moment, aware of the fragility of life and the importance of each day. As we continue our journey through the medieval times, remember to keep in mind the vast differences between our modern lives and those of our ancestors. It's easy to romanticize the past, but the reality was often much more complex and challenging. Yet, it's also important to remember that our ancestors were just as human as we are. They laughed, cried, loved, and dreamed just like we do. They were a product of their time, just as we are a product of ours. As we learn more about their lives, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own history, and perhaps even a new perspective on our own lives. Now, as you close your eyes and drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to the medieval times. Imagine the sound of the rooster crowing at dawn, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, the feeling of the cool morning air on your face as you step outside to start your day. Let these images lull you to sleep as we prepare to continue our journey through the medieval times in our next session. As we continue our journey through the medieval period, delving into the everyday life of the average person, we find ourselves stepping into the world of a medieval peasant. The life of a peasant during medieval times was drastically different from the lives we lead today, filled with hardships and adversity that are difficult for us to fully comprehend. The average peasant's days started at dawn with the rising of the sun. This was long before the invention of alarm clocks. So the first light of day signaled the beginning of their labor-intensive routines. The majority of peasants were farmers, their lives strictly dictated by the changing seasons and what they could grow. In the spring, they would begin by plowing their fields using rudimentary tools made from wood and iron. This was a grueling task, often taking several weeks to complete. Once the fields were plowed, they would then begin sowing the seeds for their crops. Wheat, barley, oats, rye, and legumes were among the most common crops grown. The work was backbreaking, requiring long hours of physical labor in the fields. After the seeding process, the peasants' focus shifted to the maintenance of their crops. They would spend the summer months weeding and ensuring their crops were receiving enough water. This was a constant battle against nature, as unexpected storms or droughts could easily destroy their hard work and leave them without food for the coming winter. When autumn arrived, it was time for the peasants to reap what they had sown. The harvest was a crucial time, determining whether they would have enough food to survive the winter. After the harvest, the remaining stalks and straw were used for a variety of purposes. They provided fodder for the livestock, bedding for the family, and thatch for the roofs of their homes. Winter, in contrast, was a time of relative inactivity. The fields lay low, and the peasants spent their time carrying out repair work on their homes or tools, as well as tending to their livestock. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens were typical animals that a peasant might raise. These animals provided them with essential resources like milk, wool, meat, and eggs. In addition to farming, peasants also had to pay taxes to their feudal lord. These taxes were often paid in the form of crops or labor. It was not uncommon for a peasant to spend several days each year working on the lord's lands as part of their tax obligation. This was known as the corv system and was a significant burden on the peasant population. Despite the hardships, life wasn't always work for the peasants. They did have some time for rest and recreation. Sundays were usually kept as a day of rest and worship. The church played a significant role in the lives of the peasants, providing them with spiritual guidance and a sense of community. Festivals and holy days also gave them a chance to take a break from their labor and celebrate with their friends and neighbors. Marriages and births were cause for celebration, and even the harshness of winter brought with it the joy of Christmas. Festivities, music, and dance were popular forms of entertainment, and despite their difficult lives, the peasants found ways to express their creativity and joy. However, the life of a peasant in medieval times was undoubtedly difficult. The physical labor was intense, the diet was poor, and the living conditions were often cramped and unsanitary. Illness and disease were common, and the average life expectancy was significantly lower than it is today. Despite these conditions, the medieval peasant was a resilient individual. They adapted to their circumstances, found joy in the simple pleasures of life, and formed close-knit communities that helped them survive. Their lives were far from easy, but they laid the groundwork for many of the farming practices we still use today. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let's appreciate the comforts and conveniences of modern life that we often take for granted. As we journey further into the past, we continue to gain perspective on our present, understanding the struggles and triumphs that have shaped our world. In our next section, we will explore the world of the medieval knight, tunneling deeper into the intricate layers of medieval society. But for now, let's let the rhythm of a peasant's life lull us into a peaceful and restful slumber. Good night. In our seventh segment, we delve into the social structure of the medieval era, a time when society was starkly divided into classes, and one's birth essentially determined the course of their life. The feudal system, which was the primary social structure during the medieval period, was akin to a pyramid. At the top was the king, who granted land to his most important noblemen, known as baronses. Below the baronses were the knights, and at the very bottom were the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population. Life at the top of the pyramid was relatively comfortable. Kings and noblemen lived in grand castles surrounded by servants, who catered to their every whim. They dined on a variety of foods, including meat, fish, and exotic fruits, while wearing luxurious clothing made of silk and velvet. Despite this, their lives were far from easy. Kings and noblemen were constantly involved in political maneuvering and warfare as they sought to protect their lands and increase their power. Knights, situated in the middle of the social pyramid, had a slightly different experience. They were granted land by their lords in return for their military service. Knights were expected to be brave, chivalrous, and skilled in combat. Their lives were dominated by warfare and the pursuit of honor. Despite the romanticized image we have of knights today, their lives were often brutal and short. Many knights died young, either in battle or as a result of the injuries they sustained. Life at the bottom of the pyramid, the life of a peasant, was incredibly hard. Peasants worked long hours in the fields growing crops to feed themselves and their lords. They lived in simple, one-room huts with dirt floors and few possessions. Their diet consisted mainly of bread, vegetables, and occasionally a bit of cheese or bacon. Despite their hard work, peasants were often at the mercy of their lords, who could raise rents or demand more labor at any time. The medieval period was also a time of religious fervor. The Catholic Church was the dominant religious institution, and its influence permeated every aspect of life. The Pope, who was considered God's representative on earth, held enormous power. People were expected to attend church services, regularly paid tithes to the church, and live their lives according to Christian teachings. Those who didn't were considered heretics and could face severe punishment, including excommunication or even death. The Middle Ages were also a time of great intellectual activity, despite the widespread illiteracy. Monasteries were the centers of learning, where monks painstakingly copied out books by hand. These works, many of them religious texts, were the primary source of knowledge during this time. The medieval era was a time of stark contrasts. On one hand, it was a time of great beauty with the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the creation of stunning works of art. On the other hand, it was a time of great brutality and suffering with constant warfare, widespread poverty, and a lack of basic human rights. As we continue our journey through the medieval era, we will explore more about the lives of the people who lived during this time, the challenges they faced, and the innovations they made. Despite the hardships, the medieval period was a time of great change and progress, setting the stage for the modern world we know today. Take a moment to imagine living in this era, the sounds of the marketplace, the smell of the earth after a day in the fields, the taste of simple hearty food after a hard day's work. As you do, let the stress and worries of your day fade away, replaced by a feeling of peace and tranquility. Let us continue our in-depth exploration into the daily life of the medieval period. As our journey through time unfolds, you might begin to realize that a day in the life of a medieval individual was far from the romanticized versions often depicted in popular culture. For the average person living in medieval Europe, life was far from easy. The day would begin at dawn with the first light of the sun. Most people lived in small one-room houses with thatched roofs. These houses offered little in the way of privacy or comfort. The floor was typically made of dirt, and the only furniture would be a rough-hewn table and benches. In the corner, there would be a small fire pit for cooking and warmth. The house would often be shared with livestock, adding to the discomfort. Upon rising, the medieval individual would start their day by attending to their chores, which was primarily dictated by their particular social status and occupation. The majority of people were peasants, working the land for their feudal lord. Their day would be spent in hard labor, tilling the fields, planting crops, and taking care of the livestock. They would work from sun-up to sundown with only a short break for lunch. Food in the medieval period was also a far cry from what we are accustomed to today. The average diet consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables. Meat was a luxury that few could afford, and fruits were only available seasonally. The lack of variety and nutrition in the diet often led to health problems, including malnutrition and scurvy. For those living in towns and cities, life was somewhat different, but no less harsh. The streets were narrow, crowded, and dirty, with waste and garbage often thrown into the street. Sanitation was a major problem, leading to frequent outbreaks of disease. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. On top of these physical hardships, there was also the psychological toll of living in a society where life was cheap and violence was commonplace. The threat of war was ever present, with kingdoms and fiefdoms constantly in conflict. Public executions were common, and the rule of law was often arbitrary and brutal. Yet, despite these hardships, people in the medieval period found ways to enjoy life. They celebrated festivals and holidays with great enthusiasm, often involving music, dance, and copious amounts of alcohol. Religion also played a major role in their lives, providing a sense of purpose and community. Religion was not just a matter of personal belief, but a central part of everyday life. The church played a significant role in the community, providing not only spiritual guidance, but also basic social services. The local priest would often be the only person in the village who could read and write. He would perform weddings, funerals, and baptisms, and also provide basic medical care. In conclusion, life in the medieval period was a constant struggle for survival. It was a time of harsh realities where the average person lived a life of hard labor, poor nutrition, and constant uncertainty. Yet it was also a time of deep faith and communal bonds, where people found joy in the simple pleasures of life. If you were to spend a day in medieval times, you would likely find it a challenging, but also a profoundly human experience. As we continue to delve further into the medieval era, we will explore more about the intricacies of daily life, the societal structure, and the cultural beliefs that shaped this fascinating period in history. So, close your eyes and imagine a world far removed from our own, where life was simple yet fraught with challenges. We'll continue our journey through the ages, immersing ourselves in the sights, sounds, and experiences of the medieval times. As we continue our journey into the gripping yet often unsettling world of medieval times, let us now turn our attention to the intricate social order of the period, which was a far cry from what we are accustomed to in our modern democratic societies. In the medieval world where you were born and to whom had a profound impact on your lot in life, the social structure was rigidly hierarchical, and opportunities for social mobility were few and far between. At the top of the social pyramid was the monarch, the ultimate authority who ruled by divine right. The king was the law, his word was final, and his power was absolute. Just below the king were the nobles. The nobility was a privileged class, enjoying wealth, power, and prestige. They owned vast tracts of land, lived in opulent castles, and commanded private armies. Yet they, too, had obligations. They were expected to provide military service to the king, administer justice, and maintain order in their territories. Beneath the nobles were the knights, a warrior class who owed their allegiance to a lord. Knights were professional soldiers trained from a young age to fight in the king's wars. They were rewarded with land and privileges, but their lives were not easy. They were expected to be brave, loyal, and honorable, to uphold the chivalric code, and to be ready to lay down their lives for their lord and king. Next came the clergy, who held a unique position in medieval society. They were not only spiritual leaders, but also wielded significant temporal power. The church was the richest and most powerful institution in medieval Europe, owning vast estates, collecting tithes, and exercising influence over all levels of society. The clergy were often the only literate people in the community, and they played a crucial role in education, charity, and administration. And then at the bottom of the social pyramid were the peasants. This was the largest and most disadvantaged group in medieval society. They worked the land, tilled the fields, and tended the livestock, their labor providing the food and other resources that sustained the entire society. Yet they were often treated as little more than chattels, tied to the land and their lord. With few rights and little hope of improving their circumstances, life as a peasant was hard and unrelenting. The working day started at dawn and ended at dusk, with only a few short breaks for meals. The work was physically demanding, and there was no respite, no weekends, no holidays, and yet the fruits of their labor mostly went to their lord, in the form of rent, taxes, and services. Food was simple and monotonous. A typical diet consisted of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat and fish being a rare luxury. Clothing was coarse and practical, made from wool or linen and often worn until it fell apart. Homes were small, dark, and crowded with entire families living in a single room. Peasants were subject to the will of their lord, who had the power to decide almost every aspect of their lives. They could be bought, sold, or given away at their lord's whim. They were subject to harsh punishments for any transgressions, real or imagined, and they had little recourse to justice, as the legal system was heavily biased in favor of the nobility. Despite these hardships, the peasants were not entirely without agency. They had their own customs and traditions, their own ways of making sense of the world. They celebrated the changing seasons, the harvest, and the holy days, finding joy and solace in their communities and their faith. And so, as we reach the end of this section of our journey, let us take a moment to reflect on the resilience and tenacity of the human spirit, even in the face of such adversity. The world of the medieval peasant may seem harsh and unforgiving to us now, but it was their reality, their everyday life, and they found ways to endure, to survive, and even to thrive in their own humble way. So as you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of their lives, their struggles, and their triumphs lull you into a deep, peaceful slumber filled with dreams of a time long past, yet not entirely forgotten. And remember, as the dawn of a new day breaks, that we too have our challenges, our struggles, and our triumphs, and that we too are part of the great tapestry of human history, every bit as complex, as vibrant, and as fascinating as the world of the medieval times. Good night. As we continue on our journey through the Middle Ages, let's shift our focus to the daily life of the common people. It's easy to imagine the glamorous knights and the grandeur of the lofty castles, but the reality of medieval times was often far from this romanticized vision. To truly understand the challenges of this era, we must delve into the life of the everyday folk who formed the backbone of medieval society. The majority of people in the Middle Ages were peasants, and their daily lives revolved around hard work. They lived in small villages and worked on the land, growing crops or rearing animals. The day began at dawn with the crowing of the rooster. The life of a peasant was dictated by the sun and the seasons. In the winter months, when there was less daylight, they would rise later, but in the summer they would often be up before sunrise, getting ready for a long day of toil in the fields. Their homes were simple, usually 1 or 2 room structures made of wood or dubwool and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure. The floor was typically a compacted earth, and there was a hole in the roof to let out smoke from the fire. Furniture was minimal and crude, and they slept on straw pallets covered with skins or coarse cloth. A peasant's home was also the place where they would eat, sleep, and work on their craft, be it weaving, brewing, or blacksmithing. Work was relentless for the medieval peasant. Their primary responsibility was to produce food. They would plow, sow seeds, and harvest crops. They also took care of animals, milked cows, made cheese, and collected eggs. In addition to this, they were also responsible for building and repairing their homes and tools. Every member of the family, including children, was expected to contribute in some way. Beyond their grueling work, peasants also had obligations to their lord in return for the right to live on and work a piece of land. They owed their lord a certain number of days' labor each year. This was called the corve, and could include tasks like building roads, bridges, and fortifications, or harvesting the lord's crops. The diet of a medieval peasant was simple and monotonous. They ate a lot of bread, usually made from rye or barley, as well as vegetables like cabbage, beans, onions, and peas. Meat was a rare luxury and was typically reserved for special occasions. Instead, they often ate fish, which they could catch themselves in the local rivers or streams. Their drink was usually ale or beer, as water was often unsafe to drink. Despite the hardship, there were moments of joy and community in a peasant's life. They celebrated the changing of the seasons, the harvest, and religious holidays with feasts, music, and dance. These moments of mirth and merriment provided a much-needed break from the monotony of their everyday life. However, the life of a medieval peasant was fraught with uncertainty. Crop failure due to bad weather or pests could lead to famine. And even in good times, the threat of disease was ever present. Without modern medicine, a simple infection could become deadly. Moreover, the constant threat of war loomed over their heads. If their village was in the path of an advancing army, they could lose everything. In understanding the life of the medieval peasant, we can appreciate the immense challenges they faced. Their existence was often brutal and short. Yet, they endured, and their labor laid the foundation for the society we know today. As we close this section, let's take a moment to reflect on the resilience of these humble folk who toiled from dawn till dusk and whose stories are often overshadowed by the grand tales of knights and kings. In medieval times, the majority of the populace were serfs, a type of peasant who worked the land. The very land they toiled on was owned by a lord who in turn owed allegiance to a higher lord and so on up to the king. A serf's life was one of relentless labor, and their daily existence was dictated by the changing seasons and the demands of their lord. They would start their day at the crack of dawn, with the first light of day serving as their alarm clock. Their day would begin with feeding their animals, which often included cows, sheep, and chickens. The animals were vital to a serf's livelihood, providing milk, wool, eggs, and occasionally meat. Following this, the serfs would head to the fields. Depending on the time of year, they might be sowing seeds, harvesting crops, or plowing the fields. These tasks were physically demanding and involved hours of backbreaking work, often under the harsh elements. There were no weekends or holidays for a serf. Their work was never truly done. After a long day in the fields, the serfs would return home. Their homes were simple one-room structures, often shared with their animals. There was no glass in the windows. The floors were made of hard-packed earth, and the only furniture would be a rough wooden table and stools. Dinner would be a simple affair, consisting of dark bread made from a type of grain called rye, and a thin soup made from vegetables grown in their garden. Meat was a rarity, saved for special occasions. They would eat their meal by the light of a tallow candle made from animal fat. Despite the hardships of their daily life, serfs found joy in simple pleasures. They would often sing songs while they worked in the fields, a practice that helped to lighten the load of their labor. On Sundays, they would attend church, a mandatory requirement, but also a chance to socialize with their neighbors. However, the life of a serf was not just hard work. They were subject to the whims and wishes of their lord if their lord decided to go to war. The serfs were expected to fight. This was a dangerous proposition, as they often lacked proper training and equipment. The life of a serf was also precarious. A bad harvest could lead to starvation, and disease was a constant threat. Without access to modern medical treatments, a simple injury or illness could easily turn deadly. As we weave through the tapestry of history, it becomes clear that our modern conveniences are a product of centuries of progress. The next time you find yourself longing for the simplicity of a bygone era, consider the serfs of medieval times. Their lives were anything but simple, filled with hard labor, constant uncertainty, and a lack of basic comforts. In the next section, we will delve deeper into the social hierarchy of medieval times and explore the lives of the lords and ladies. But for now, let the sound of my voice and the images of medieval life lull you into a peaceful sleep. Remember, the past is a different country. They do things differently there. As we journey through history, we gain a greater appreciation for the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the stories of the past guide you into dreamland. Good night. As we continue our exploration of the medieval period, we find ourselves in the heart of medieval society, the village. These communities were not just clustered homes, but intricate systems of survival and cooperation, bound by a shared necessity to work the land and serve the lord of the manor. The typical medieval village was a collection of families living in close proximity to each other, with houses built from local materials. In England, these would usually be double-bile and dorby constructions, walls woven from pliable branches and covered in a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched using reeds or straw, and a hole in the roof would allow smoke from the fire to escape. The houses were small and dark with few windows due to the expense of glass. Life began early in the village, with the cock's crow signaling the start of another day of labor. The majority of the villagers were serfs, individuals who were tied to the land and had to provide labor services to the lord of the manor. These services varied but typically included plowing the lord's fields, harvesting his crops, and maintaining his roads and fences. In return, the serfs were allowed to work their own strips of land to produce food for their families. The medieval diet was far from the varied and balanced meals we enjoy today. Most peasants subsisted on a diet of bread, cheese, and vegetables, with meat being a rare treat. Ale was often safer to drink than water, as the brewing process killed off bacteria. However, it was weak and not the intoxicating beverage we might imagine. Children would have drunk it as well as adults, and it would have been consumed throughout the day. The life of a serf was not just hard labor, however. There were times of celebration and relaxation, such as the end of the harvest, when villagers would feast and dance. The church also provided a structure of festivals and holy days, which offered a break from the toil of everyday life. These occasions would be eagerly anticipated, with villages indulging in food, drink, and merriment. However, medieval villages lived with the constant threat of disease. The unsanitary conditions in which they lived made them ripe for outbreaks of illness. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the 14th century, wiped out entire villages, leaving fields untended and livestock roaming free. The lack of medical knowledge and the belief in supernatural causes for diseases made these outbreaks all the more deadly. Despite the hardships, there was a sense of community within the village. Everyone had a role to play and was dependent on their neighbors for survival. The shared experiences of work, celebration, and adversity created strong bonds between villages. They supported each other through difficult times and shared in each other's joys and sorrows. However, this sense of community also had a darker side. Villagers were suspicious of outsiders and anything that deviated from the norm. This fear of the unknown could lead to accusations of witchcraft and other forms of supernatural mischief. These accusations could have dire consequences, with those accused often being ostracized, tortured, or even killed. As we delve deeper into the realities of life in the medieval period, it becomes clear that surviving in these times required strength, resilience, and a strong sense of community. It was a time of hard work and hardship, but also one of shared experiences and communal ties. Life in a medieval village was not for the faint of heart, but for those who could bear the toil and danger. It was a life lived to the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. So as we continue our journey through the medieval period, let's remember the serfs and their struggles, and appreciate the relative comfort and safety of our own lives. As we continue to weave our way through the fabric of medieval life, we find ourselves at the heart of a bustling medieval town. The air is filled with the chatter of townsfolk, the clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, and the distant hum of a lute. The streets, narrow and winding, aligned with timber-framed houses. These structures lean precariously over the street, their second stories jutting out over the first in a way that seems to defy gravity. The overhanging upper floors were designed this way to maximize living space without encroaching on the street below. A clever solution to the problem of limited urban space. Most houses in a medieval town were multifunctional. The lower floor often served as a workshop or a shop with the family living in the rooms above. These homes were compact and practical, but they lacked the comforts and conveniences we take for granted today. There was no running water, no central heating, and no electricity. Instead, people relied on wells or nearby rivers for water, used fireplaces for warmth and candles, or rushlights for illumination. Privacy was also a luxury that many could not afford in the Middle Ages. It was common for entire families to sleep in one room, often sharing their quarters with apprentices or servants. This close living quarters, combined with the lack of sanitation, meant that illness could spread rapidly through a household. It was not uncommon for entire families to be wiped out by diseases such as the bubonic plague, which decimated the population of Europe in the 14th century. Medieval towns were also notoriously dirty places. Without a proper sewage system, waste was often thrown into the street or dumped into rivers. This lack of sanitation, coupled with the close living quarters, made towns a breeding ground for disease. The stench, as you can imagine, was overwhelming. Visitors to medieval towns often commented on the foul smell that permeated the air, a potent mix of sewage, rotting food, and animal waste. And yet, despite these harsh conditions, towns were a hub of activity in the Middle Ages. They were the economic heart of medieval society. Where goods were produced and traded, towns were home to a variety of craftsmen, including blacksmiths, bakers, weavers, and brewers, all of whom played a vital role in the economy. Markets were held regularly, drawing people from the surrounding countryside to buy and sell goods. In addition to their economic function, towns also served as centers of social and political activity. Towns were often fortified with walls and towers, providing protection to their inhabitants in times of war. They were also home to important institutions such as the church and the town hall, which played key roles in the governance and spiritual life of the community. Towns also offered opportunities for social mobility. While the rural peasantry was largely tied to the land, townspeople had the chance to amass wealth through trade and craft. This gave rise to a new social class, the bourgeoisie or middle class, who wielded considerable economic power. However, life in medieval towns was not all work. There were also opportunities for leisure and entertainment. Fairs and festivals were common, providing a chance for people to socialize and enjoy themselves. Music, dance, and theater were popular forms of entertainment, and taverns were a favorite gathering place for townsfolk. But as we drift away from the hustle and bustle of the town, remember that while life in the Middle Ages was undoubtedly challenging, it was not without its moments of joy and celebration. Despite the hardships, people found ways to carve out meaningful lives, to find happiness, and to dream of a better future, an enduring testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we continue our journey through this fascinating period in history, let us carry with us not only an understanding of the challenges faced by those who lived in medieval times, but also a deep appreciation for their resilience, their ingenuity, and their unyielding hope. As we continue our journey into the Middle Ages, let us now delve into the fascinating and somewhat harsh realities of daily life during this period. The medieval lifestyle was a stark contrast to the comforts and conveniences we enjoy today. And it's not difficult to understand why surviving in such times would be a daunting task for many of us. Firstly, the concept of hygiene as we know it today was significantly different during the Middle Ages. Bathing was not a daily ritual, and public baths were more a space for socializing than cleanliness. The water used in these communal wash places was rarely changed throughout the day, which meant the last person to bathe was essentially washing in the dirt and grime of everyone who had bathed before them. This lack of personal hygiene led to outbreaks of diseases such as the infamous Black Death. Now let's talk about the dietary habits of the medieval populace. The diet during the Middle Ages was not particularly varied or nutritional. Meat was a luxury that only the wealthy could afford on a regular basis, while the poor subsisted on a diet primarily composed of grains and vegetables. This lack of diversity in the diet often led to malnutrition and other health problems. Moreover, the cooking methods of the time were primitive, and food was often overcooked or undercooked, leading to digestive issues. In terms of housing, the dwellings of the medieval period were far from comfortable. The majority of the population lived in small, cramped cottages made from WL and daub. These structures were poorly insulated, making them freezing cold in the winter and stiflingly hot in the summer. Additionally, these houses lacked proper ventilation, resulting in a smoky, stuffy atmosphere from the cooking fires. Furthermore, the role of women in medieval society was vastly different from what it is today. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and their duties revolved around raising children and managing household chores. They had very little autonomy or rights and could not own property or hold positions of power. This lack of independence and self-determination would undoubtedly be a shock to the modern sensibilities. The concept of entertainment, too, was vastly different in the Middle Ages. Without the luxury of technology, people had to find amusement in simpler, more physical activities. These included sports like archery and wrestling, as well as communal events like fairs and feasts. However, these forms of entertainment often carried risks of injury or even death, especially in events such as jousting tournaments. Religion played a central role in medieval life, and the church held a great deal of power and influence. Daily life was governed by religious observances and rituals, and any deviation from the church's teachings was viewed with suspicion and often met with severe punishment. This rigid adherence to religious doctrine often stifled intellectual and scientific progress. In terms of employment, most people in the Middle Ages worked in agriculture. The work was grueling and the hours were long, often from sunrise to sunset. There was no concept of weekends or holidays, and workers were expected to toil endlessly for their survival. This level of physical labor would be unfamiliar and likely unbearable to many of us today. Lastly, the medical practices of the Middle Ages were rudimentary at best. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and diseases, and their treatments often involved bloodletting or the use of leeches. There were no antibiotics or painkillers, and surgery was a risky endeavor, often resulting in death. As we navigate through the realities of medieval life, it becomes clear that the hardships and challenges of this era would make survival incredibly difficult for those accustomed to modern conveniences. The next time you find yourself longing for the simplicity of the good old days, remember the trials and tribulations of the people who lived during the Middle Ages, and take a moment to appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. As we continue our exploration of history, we uncover more about the human spirit and resilience, and perhaps gain a deeper appreciation for our own times. As we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, let's explore the daily life of a commoner. A stark contrast to the knights and nobility we've previously discussed. Imagine waking up with the first light of day, the air still cool and crisp to the Ruers's crow echoing across the village. A simple straw mattress would act as your bed, and your blanket might be a rough-spun woolen cloth. The house most likely would be a single room shared by your entire family. The walls formed of WL and daub woven sticks filled in with a mixture of mud, straw, and dung, hardly offered much insulation from the cold or the noise of the village waking up. Your first task of the day would be to tend to the animals. This could include milking the cows, feeding the chickens, and letting the pigs out to forage. These animals were crucial to the survival of your family, providing food, milk, and even clothing. As such, they were often treated with a level of respect and care that might seem unusual to modern sensibilities. Next, you would turn to the day's chores if you were a man. This might involve working in the fields, planting or harvesting crops. Depending on the season, you might also spend time chopping wood for the fire, mending fences, or repairing tools. If you were a woman, your day would be filled with tasks such as spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, cooking meals, and tending. To the children, the work would be hard with little time for rest. Lunch, often just a chunk of bread and some cheese, would be eaten in the fields or by the fireside. The afternoon would bring more chores, more work in the fields, perhaps a trip to the village, well for water, or a visit to the local mill to grind grain into flour. As the sun began to set, the village would come alive with the sounds of evening. The cows would be brought in from the fields, the chickens cooped up for the night, and the fire stoked for the evening meal. This meal, often a simple stew of vegetables and whatever meat was available, would be a time for the family to come together to share the day's news and enjoy each other's company. After the meal, there might be a few hours for relaxation. Perhaps you would sit by the fire mending clothes or carving wooden utensils. Perhaps you would listen to stories told by the elders, tales of heroes and monsters that had been passed down through the generations. Or perhaps you would simply sit in quiet, contemplation, staring into the fire and dreaming of a better life. By the time you crawled into bed, the fire would be dying down, and the only sound would be the soft snoring of your family and the distant hoot of an owl. You would fall asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same, more work, more chores, more struggles, but also more moments of joy, more stories, more dreams. Life in the Middle Ages was hard, but it was not without its moments of beauty, the changing of the seasons, the birth of a new lamb, the harvest of the crops. These were all occasions for celebration. The sense of community was strong, with everyone working together for the common good. And despite the hardships, people found ways to enjoy life, to laugh, to love, to dream. So, as we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, let's not forget the common people, the men and women who worked the land, raised the animals, and kept the fires burning. Their lives may seem difficult to us, but to them it was simply life. And in that life they found moments of joy, moments of beauty, moments of peace. And isn't that, after all, what we all seek in our own lives? As the night deepens and the stars twinkle overhead, let your mind wander back to those simple, hard-working people of the Middle Ages. Imagine their lives, their struggles, their joys. And as you drift off to sleep, remember that we are all connected through time and space by the simple act of living, of working, of dreaming. Good night, dear listener. Sleep well. In our exploration of medieval times, we have journeyed through the harsh realities of life in the period, examining the societal dynamics, the basic amenities, and the physical and mental tolls of the era. As we continue our exploration, we delve deeper into the arduous daily routines of a medieval person. The day would typically start at dawn. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of alarm clocks, but they did have nature's own alarm system, the crowing of the rooster. As the sun began to peak over the horizon, the ruler's call would echo through the countryside, signaling the beginning of a new day. The medieval household would stir, with the lady of the house being among the first to rise. Her tasks for the day were manifold. In a society that was largely agrarian, the wife's role was crucial for the family's survival. She would tend to the garden, milk the cows, and ensure that the livestock were well fed and cared for. She would also prepare meals, clean the house, and care for the children, the elderly, and the sick. The husband, meanwhile, would have his own set of tasks. Depending on his profession, he might spend his day tilling the fields, chewing horses, crafting tools, or constructing buildings. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. There were no safety regulations to protect workers, and accidents were common. Children in the Middle Ages did not have the luxury of a carefree childhood. They were expected to contribute to the household from an early age. Once a child reached the age of 7, they could be sent away to work as an apprentice or a servant in another household. The concept of childhood as a time of innocence and play is a relatively modern idea. Education was not a priority in the medieval times. Most people were illiterate, and formal education was reserved for the privileged few. The church was the primary source of education, and monks were among the most educated people of the time. They would spend their days in monastic libraries, painstakingly copying out manuscripts by hand. Despite the hardships of daily life, medieval people did have leisure time. They enjoyed music, dancing, and games. The church also provided a source of entertainment with its numerous feast days and festivals. These were times of celebration and merntimement when people could forget their toil for a while and simply enjoy themselves. But even in their leisure time, the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages were never far away. The specter of disease was always present, with outbreaks of illnesses such as the bubonic plague decimating entire communities. Lack of sanitation and understanding of disease transmission meant that these outbreaks were often deadly. As we drift towards the end of this section, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the harsh realities of life in the medieval times, people found ways to survive, to thrive, and to find joy in the midst of adversity. As we close our eyes and imagine the sounds of the rooster crowing, the smell of the morning dew, and the rhythmic patterns of daily life, we can appreciate the simple beauty of life in the Middle Ages. In the next section, we will delve into the intricacies of medieval politics and the role of the church in shaping society. But for now, let's allow the images of daily life in the Middle Ages to lull us into a peaceful sleep, a reprieve from the rigors of our own day-to-day existence. As we continue our journey through the medieval period, we now delve into the realm of education and social mobility. Education was not a universal right or expectation as it is in many parts of the world today. Rather, it was a privilege reserved for the upper echelons of society, specifically the nobility and the clergy. The common folk who constituted the vast majority of the population were usually illiterate. Their children learned the trade of their parents, with sons following in their father's footsteps as farmers, craftsmen, or fishers, while daughters learned the art of maintaining a household from their mothers. To understand education in the Middle Ages, one must first understand the role of the church, which was the central provider of knowledge. The church was the institution that held the monopoly on learning, and the monasteries were the primary centers of education. Boys who were destined for the clergy would enter monastic schools around the age of 7, where they would receive a basic education in Latin, the language of the church, as well as rudimentary instruction in grammar and arithmetic. The monastics schools also served as a kind of scholarship system for talented boys from less privileged backgrounds. The children of nobles, on the other hand, were usually tutored at home by private teachers. These children were taught not only Latin and Greek, but also philosophy, theology, and the sciences, along with practical skills like horse riding, sword fighting, and managing a household. Girls, regardless of their social status, received little to no formal education. Instead, they were taught the domestic skills that were deemed necessary for their future roles as wives and mothers. They learned to spin and weave, to manage a household, to care for the sick, and to prepare food. In some cases, noble girls were taught to read and write, but this was the exception rather than the rule. For ordinary men and women, life in the medieval era was primarily about survival. The harsh realities of daily life left little room for intellectual pursuits. Peasants toiled from dawn to dusk in the fields, while craftsmen spent their days honing their skills in their trades. Evenings were spent in rest and recovery, preparing for the next grueling day of labor. But despite these hardships, there was a chance, albeit slim, for social mobility. A commoner could potentially elevate his status through various means. An apprentice could become a master in his craft and establish his own business. A peasant could save enough money to buy his own land and become a landowner. A soldier could distinguish himself in battle and be awarded a title of nobility. However, these opportunities were few and far between, and the majority of people remained in the social class into which they were born. The justice system of the medieval period was also a significant factor in the lives of the common people. Courts were often biased in favor of the nobility, and punishments for crimes were severe. Common punishments included fines, public humiliation, and physical harm such as flogging or mutilation. For the most serious crimes, the penalty was death, often by hanging or beheading. Interestingly, the concept of prisons as places for long-term incarceration did not exist. Prisons were mainly used to hold people awaiting trial or punishment. This was in part due to the fact that the state did not want to bear the cost of housing and feeding prisoners for extended periods of time. Also, the harshness of medieval punishments was believed to act as a deterrent to crime. In conclusion, a day in medieval times was fraught with challenges and hardships. It was a time when survival often took precedence over education and personals, growth when opportunities for social mobility were rare, and when justice was often harsh and biased. But despite these difficulties, the people of the medieval period showed remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and tenacity, qualities that have shaped the course of human history and continue to influence our world today. As we wrap up this section of our journey, let your mind absorb this rich tapestry of life in the medieval era and let it guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. As our journey through the medieval era continues, let us not forget the significance of religion during this time. Indeed, the religious aspect of life in the Middle Ages dominated much of the social, cultural, and political landscape. The Church wielded considerable power, influencing not just spiritual matters, but also the daily life of ordinary people. To understand the Middle Ages, we must understand the Church's role in this period. The Church during the Middle Ages was the single largest unified organization in Europe. It was the preserver of scholarship and literacy during a time when much of Europe was in disarray. Monasteries scattered across the continent became the centers of learning and education. Monks hand-copied books in the scriptoriums, preserving ancient texts, a knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The Church's influence was not limited to spiritual matters. It extended into the realms of art and culture, politics, and even war. In the labyrinth of medieval society, the Church provided order and structure. It was the institution that touched every aspect of daily life. The Church dictated the calendar, marking the year with religious festivals and holy days. It provided welfare for the poor and needy, ran schools and hospitals, and even served as the primary legal institution. Ecclesiastical courts overseen by the Church dealt with a wide range of issues from marriage and inheritance disputes to criminal cases. The Church was also deeply intertwined with politics. Monarchs and nobles vied for the Church's favor, seeking its endorsement to legitimize their rule. The Pope, as the head of the Church, held considerable power, often acting as a mediator in disputes between kingdoms. The Church also had its own territories and armies, and it was not uncommon for it to be involved in military conflicts. In the spiritual domain, the Church held a monopoly over salvation. The doctrine of the time held that there was no salvation outside the Church, and this belief had a profound impact on people's lives. The fear of eternal damnation was a powerful motivator compelling individuals to adhere to the Church's teachings and participate in its rituals. Daily life was intertwined with the rhythms of the liturgical calendar, with regular attendance at Mass, confession, and other sacraments. However, life in the Middle Ages was not entirely dominated by piety and devotion. There was also room for merriment, celebration, and even a bit of irreverence. Medieval people had their festivals and feasts, their dances and games. The Church may have disapproved of some of these activities, but it was often powerless to stop them. The Church might have dominated the landscape, but it did not completely control the hearts and minds of the people, and yet the Church was not a monolithic entity. It was marked by divisions and conflicts, both internal and external. There were disputes over doctrine, power struggles within the hierarchy, and conflicts with secular authorities. The Church faced challenges from heretical movements such as the Cathars and the Lards, who questioned its teachings and authority. The Church also faced criticism for its wealth and corruption, leading to calls for reform. Despite these challenges, the Church remained a powerful and influential institution throughout the Middle Ages. It provided a sense of stability and order in a chaotic world, offering hope, comfort, and the promise of salvation. It was a source of authority, education, and welfare, deeply ingrained in the fabric of medieval society. So, as you lay there, drifting closer to sleep, imagine the tolling of church bells, the chant of monks in the monastery, the hustle and bustle of a medieval fair on a church holiday. Consider the myriad ways in which the Church permeated every aspect of life in the Middle Ages. And as you close your eyes and surrender to sleep, remember that our journey through medieval times continues as we delve deeper into the rich tapestry of this fascinating period. In our exploration of medieval times, we have journeyed through the robust castles, the bustling marketplaces, and the laborious farmlands. We have come to understand the intricate social structures and the profound importance of religion. Now, as we delve into the third section of our journey, let us turn our attention towards the challenging daily routines and the fascinating culture of these ancient times. Imagine waking up with the sunrise, the light seeping through the narrow slits that serve as windows in your modest wooden home. Your bed would not be the plush comfort that we are accustomed to today. It would likely be a hard straw mattress, perhaps shared with other members of your family. The very concept of privacy, as we understand it today, did not exist in the same form during the medieval period, particularly for those of the lower classes. As you rise from your bed, you would need to tend to your animals. Chickens would need to be fed, cows milked, and horses groomed. This would not be a task to be taken lightly, as these animals represented a vital source of food and livelihood. They would provide you with eggs, milk, and meat, and their manure would be used to fertilize your fields. Breakfast, if you were fortunate enough to have it, would consist of a simple fare. Bread, cheese, and perhaps a portion of last night's stew would serve to break your fast. Yet, food was often scarce, especially during the winter months. You would need to ration your food carefully to ensure it lasted until the next harvest. Once your initial tasks were completed, it would be time to begin your day's work. If you were a peasant, this would likely involve a long day of physically demanding labor in the fields. You would be expected to plow, sow, and harvest the crops, a task made even more challenging by the primitive tools available at the time. If you were a craftsman, your day would be filled with the meticulous creation of goods. Blacksmiths would labor over hot forges, shaping metal into tools, weapons, and household items. Tailor would painstakingly stitch together garments, while carpenters would construct furniture and buildings. Regardless of your occupation, the workday would be long and arduous. There were no weekends or holidays as we know them today. You would work from dawn until dusk, with only a brief pause for a midday meal. This meal, known as the main meal, would be more substantial than breakfast. It might include a thick stew, a chunk of meat, and perhaps a piece of fruit or a handful of nuts. Despite the hardships, there would be moments of leisure in the medieval times. You might play a game of chess or backgammon, or perhaps engage in a lively dance at a local festival. Music was also an integral part of medieval life, with troubadours traveling from town to town, sharing songs and stories. As the day drew to a close, you would return home to prepare for the evening meal. This was usually a more modest affair than the midday meal, often consisting of leftovers or a simple porridge. After the meal, you would gather around the hearth, sharing stories and songs with your family. As the flames flickered and the darkness crept in, you would retire to your straw bed, ready to start the cycle again with the next sunrise. So, as we drift further into the narrative of the medieval times, we can appreciate the stark contrast of our modern conveniences with the rigorous routines of the past. We can marvel at the resilience and resourcefulness of the individuals who navigated through these challenging times. And as we tuck ourselves into our comfortable beds tonight, we can reflect on the lessons we can learn from history and how it shapes our understanding of the present and the future. At the heart of the medieval period, also known as the Middle Ages, was the feudal system. This was a social structure that dictated the roles and responsibilities of every individual within society. At the top of this hierarchy was the king, who was endowed with the right to rule by divine providence. Below the king were the nobles, who swore their fealty to him. These included dukes, barons, and ears, the so-called lords of the realm. Their oath of loyalty included a promise to provide the king with knights for military service, a practice that was commonplace during this era of frequent territorial disputes. In return for their loyalty and service, the king granted these noblemen land, also known as fiefs. These lands were worked by serfs or peasants who were bound to the land and not allowed to leave without the lord's permission. It's important to remember that serfdom wasn't considered slavery, but it was far from a life of freedom. Serfs were required to work the land, growing crops, and raising livestock, which could be claimed by their lord at any time. They also had to pay taxes and were subject to the lord's justice. The life of a serf was incredibly hard. They lived in small, cramped cottages with thatched roofs and walls made from wool and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. These homes offered little protection from the elements, and during the winter months they could become unbearably cold. The majority of a serf's time was spent working the fields from dawn until dusk. The work was backbreaking, and there were no weekends or days off. Their diet was poor and monotonous, consisting primarily of pottage, a type of thick soup made from peas, beans, and onions. If they were lucky, they might have some cheese or a bit of bacon to add to their meal. But for most, the diet was vegetarian out of necessity, not choice. It was a time when the saying, "You are what you eat," took on a literal meaning, as malnutrition was rampant, leading to a host of health problems. In contrast, the life of a noble was one of relative luxury. They lived in castles or manor houses, fortified structures that provided protection and comfort. Their diet was varied and plentiful, with meats, fish, fruits, and vegetables regularly on the menu. In addition to their duties to the king, nobles also had responsibilities to their serfs, such as providing protection and ensuring justice was served. However, the application of justice was often skewed in favor of the nobility, with serfs receiving harsher punishments for the same crimes. Medieval society was deeply religious, with the Catholic Church playing a central role in people's lives. The Church dictated the calendar, with numerous saints' days and religious festivals providing a break from the relentless toil of fieldwork. These festivals also provided an opportunity for people to come together as a community, with feasting, drinking, and games. However, the Church also wielded significant power and influence, with bishops and abbots often acting as advisors to the king. The Church had its own system of law, known as canon law, which was used to regulate matters of faith and morality. This included everything from marriage and divorce to heresy and blasphemy. Those found guilty of breaking canon law could face severe punishments, including excommunication, which was a form of social and spiritual death. Yet despite the hardships and challenges of life in the Middle Ages, people found ways to find joy and meaning. Music and dance were important forms of entertainment, with troubadours and minstrels traveling from town to town, singing songs and telling stories. Craftsmen took pride in their work, creating beautiful objects from wood, metal, and stone. And while their lives may have been short and often filled with hardship, the people of the Middle Ages also understood the importance of community, family, and faith. As you drift off to sleep, consider the stark contrasts of medieval life. The lofty castles and humble cottages, the rich feasts of the nobility, and the simple pottage of the serfs, the stern justice of the Lord, and the mercy of the Church. And remember that while the Middle Ages may seem a harsh and unforgiving time, it was also a period of great change and innovation, laying the foundations for the world we know today. As we delve deeper into the realities of life in the medieval times, we find ourselves in the heart of a bustling town. In contrast to the triumphant castles and serene countryside, these urban areas were crowded, dirty, and filled with the stench of human and animal waste. Sanitation was a concept still centuries away from being understood or implemented. Open sewers ran through the streets where rainwater was the only method of cleaning. People often tossed their waste out of their windows, adding to the squalor. This was a far cry from the cleanliness and hygiene we enjoy in the modern world. Diseases were rampant and often deadly in these conditions. The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, was the most infamous. It swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing millions. Yet it was far from the only danger. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhoid were all common and devastating without modern treatments or understanding of disease transmission. Medicine was a blend of superstition, herbal remedies, and prayers. The idea of germs and the necessity of cleanliness in preventing illness was simply not understood. In addition to disease, the risk of injury was always present. In a society without safety regulations, accidents were frequent. If you were lucky, you might simply break a bone. If not, you could be maimed or killed. Even if you survived without proper medical care, you might be left with permanent disabilities. The concept of workers' rights and welfare would not be introduced for many more centuries. Food and drink in the Middle Ages were also vastly different from what we know today. The poor often subsisted on a diet of bread, porridge, and vegetables. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for the wealthy. Most people drank ale or beer, as water was often too polluted to drink safely. Though we might romanticize the idea of a hearty medieval feast, the reality was often much more mundane and nutritionally deficient. Religion played a central role in every aspect of medieval life. It influenced law, education, and social structure. The church wielded significant power and could dictate the course of a person's life. Heresy was considered a serious crime, and punishments could be extreme. The concept of religious freedom as we understand it today did not exist. Education was also a privilege of the wealthy. For the poor, life was about survival. Children were expected to work from a young age, often in the same trade as their parents. There were no child labor laws to protect them. Literacy rates were low and books were expensive and rare. The creation of the printing press in the 15th century would revolutionize access to information. But for the majority of the Middle Ages, knowledge was held by a select few. Women's rights were severely limited during this period. Most women were expected to marry and produce children, often while still in their teens. They had little say in these arrangements, with marriages arranged for political or economic gain. Once married, a woman was expected to obey her husband in all things. Education for women was rare, and the idea of a woman holding power was often met with suspicion and fear. Despite these harsh realities, it's important to remember that people in the Middle Ages were not simply suffering through their lives. They found joy in family, community, and faith. They celebrated with feasts and festivals. They created beautiful works of art and architecture that we still admire today. They loved, laughed, and lived their lives with the same depth of emotion that we do. Yet, as modern individuals accustomed to a certain standard of living, we would find the Middle Ages a difficult, if not impossible, time to survive. The lack of sanitation, the risk of disease and injury, the limited diet, the strict social hierarchy, and the lack of rights for women and children all make this a time period that we can appreciate for its historical value, but one that we would not want to experience firsthand. As we continue to explore the past, let these insights lull you into a deep sleep, carrying with you a newfound appreciation for the comforts and conveniences of the present. As we delve deeper into the harsh realities of the medieval period, we shift our focus to the realm of health and medicine, an area where the Middle Ages were particularly unforgiving. The field of medicine was embryonic, and the understanding of the human body and its ailments were largely based on speculation, superstition, and a significant amount of trial and error. Primary health care was often provided by the lady of the house or a local wise woman without the benefit of scientific knowledge or sterile environments. Remedies were concocted from various sources, such as plants, herbs, and animal parts, and treatments were often more akin to rituals than to what we would recognize as medical practice. These remedies were passed down from generation to generation, an echo of a time when oral tradition was the primary means of preserving knowledge. Imagine suffering from a headache or a toothache and being prescribed a puce of mashed herbs or a potion brewed from the bark of certain trees. In more severe cases, practices such as bloodletting were common, with the belief that by draining the body of bad blood, the patient would be cured of their illness. This was often carried out by barber surgeons who, along with cutting hair, also performed minor surgeries and amputations. The ubiquitous barber's pole of white and red is actually a symbolic reference to this practice, the red representing blood and the white signifying the bandages. In the absence of anesthesia, pain management during these procedures was rudimentary at best. Patients were often given a strong drink to numb the pain, or in some cases physically restrained to prevent them from moving. The survival rate following these procedures was, as you can imagine, rather low. Infections were rife, and the concept of sterilizing instruments or washing hands was unheard of, as well as their rudimentary understanding of physical illnesses. Medieval medicine also had a primitive grasp on mental health. Conditions that we now understand to be psychological or neurological were often attributed to spiritual or demonic influence. Treatments for these ailments were again more ritualistic and religious than medical, involving exorcisms, prayer, and other religious rites. Epidemics and plagues were also common occurrences in the medieval period. The most infamous of these was the Black Death, a pandemic that swept across Europe in the mid-4th century, wiping out between 75 and 200 million people, approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population at the time. The cause of this devastating disease was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted through fleas on black rats. However, without the knowledge of bacteria or disease transmission, people were left helpless against the plague, with many believing it to be a punishment from God. Theories about the cause of the plague were wide-ranging and often fantastical. Some believed it was due to a misalignment of planets. Others blamed Jewish communities, leading to widespread persecution. Some people even thought that the disease was transmitted through the air, leading to the development of plague doctors who wore beaked masks filled with herbs and spices to purify the air they breathed. Despite their efforts, the plague continued to ravage Europe until the late 17th century. Despite the hardships and health hazards, people in the Middle Ages did manage to survive, albeit with a significantly lower average life expectancy than today. The resilience and resourcefulness demonstrated during this time laid the groundwork for many of the advancements in medicine and healthcare that we benefit from today. As we close this section of our journey, it is important to remember that while the Middle Ages were undoubtedly challenging, they also represented a time of remarkable human endurance and innovation. Life was not easy, but it was not impossible either. And as we venture further into the past, we continue to learn more about our ancestors' struggles and triumphs and how they shape the world we live in today. Stay with me, dear listener, as we continue our journey into the past. As we peel back the layers of history, we learn more about the resilience of ancestors, the challenges they faced, and the world they shaped for us to inherit. Sleep well and dream of a time when kings and queens ruled, knights jousted, and the world was a tapestry of mystery and wonder. Now, let us turn our attention to the daily life of a medieval serf, the lowest-ranking member of the feudal system. The life of a serf was filled with hardships and toil, a far cry from the romanticized notions of chivalry and courtly love that so often characterize our understanding of the Middle Ages. The day of a medieval serf began with the crowing of a rooster well before the sun rose. They were required to work long hours in the field, starting early in the morning and ending late in the evening. The labor was grueling and the hours long, as the serfs were responsible for tilling, planting, and harvesting the crops that would sustain the entire manor. A serf's diet was humble and monotonous. They mainly consumed dark bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a type of thick soup made from grain, peas or lentils, and ale. Meat was a luxury seldom enjoyed. Instead, the serfs supplemented their diet with vegetables from their garden plot, and occasionally fish from the local river or stream in terms of shelter. A medieval serf's home was simple and rudimentary. It was often a one-room structure made of double well and daub with a thatched roof. Inside there were few furnishings, a rough hewn table, some stools, perhaps a chest for storing clothes and valuables. There was no glass in the windows, and the floor was simply the bare earth covered with straw or reeds for insulation. Despite the hardships they faced, serfs had a rich cultural life. They celebrated the changing of the seasons and the agricultural calendar with festivities and feasts. Music, dance, and storytelling were also an integral part of their lives. For serfs, the church was the center of community and spiritual life. They were obliged to attend Mass every Sunday and on holy days, providing them a respite from their labor. Religion offered them hope for a better life in the hereafter, and the church acted as a unifying force, binding the community together. However, serfdom was not a static condition. There were different ways in which a serf could gain freedom. Some bought their way out of serfdom, while others were set free by their lords as a reward for exceptional service. In some cases, a serf could also gain freedom by escaping to a city and living there for a year and a day without being claimed by their lord. The life of a serf was a life of unending toil and hardship. However, it was also a life of community, of shared experiences, of resilience in the face of adversity. It's important to remember that despite the challenges they faced, medieval serfs were not merely passive victims of their circumstances. They found ways to survive, to create joy, to forge connections with their fellow serfs, and to carve out a sense of identity amidst the constraints of their status. As we conclude this section, let us reflect on the resilience of these individuals, who lived in a time so different from our own. Let us also remember that the strength of the human spirit is not confined to any particular era or social class. It is a universal quality as timeless as history itself. As you drift off to sleep, bear in mind the strength of the serfs who, in the face of adversity, found ways to survive, to create joy, and to forge connections. In the next section, we'll explore the role of women in medieval society, a topic that is often overlooked in historical narratives. History of medieval women is a story of resistance and resilience, of navigating a world that offered them limited freedoms. But for now, let the gentle rhythms of the serf's life lull you into a deep and restful sleep. Let us now venture into the realm of medieval occupations, jobs, and trades. The work that people undertook during this period was often backbreaking and monotonous. The majority of people in the medieval period were peasants, and their lives were dictated by the seasons and the demands of the land. A peasant would rise with the sun and work until it set. Their primary occupation was farming, and the majority of their time was spent tending to the fields. The work was grueling, with long hours spent plowing, planting, and harvesting. The tools were primitive, and the work was done mainly by hand. The physical demands of this lifestyle were immense, requiring a level of endurance and resilience that many of us in the modern world would struggle to match. A peasant's life was also one of servitude. They were tied to the land and to the lord who owned that land in return for the right to live on and work a piece of land. A peasant owed their lord a portion of their produce and their labor. This might mean helping to repair the lord's castle or providing a certain amount of grain each year. The peasant was also obliged to grind their grain at the lord's mill and to purchase goods from the lord's market. These obligations were not negotiable, and failure to meet them could result in punishment or even eviction. For those who lived in towns and cities, life was somewhat different. Here, the medieval economy was dominated by guilds. These were associations of artisans and merchants who controlled the practice of their craft in a particular town. To become a member of a guild, a person would first serve as an apprentice, learning the skills of the trade under the supervision of a master. After several years of training, the apprentice would become a journeyman and could work for wages. Finally, after proving their skill and knowledge, a journeyman could become a master and open their own workshop. Craftsmen worked long hours, often from dawn until dusk. They produced everything from clothes and shoes to furniture and tools. The work was skilled, but also repetitive and physically demanding. A blacksmith, for example, would spend hours each day hammering iron into shape. A weaver would work at their loom, creating cloth from raw wool or flax. A baker would rise before dawn to prepare bread for the day. Like peasants, craftsmen were also subject to various obligations and restrictions. They were required to pay fees to their guild and to adhere to its rules and regulations. These might dictate the quality of goods that could be produced, the prices that could be charged, and the hours that could be worked. Craftsmen were also subject to the laws and taxes of the town or city in which they lived. Even those in positions of power and privilege faced their own challenges. The nobility, for example, were obliged to provide military service to the king. This could mean leading troops into battle or providing soldiers and equipment for the king's campaigns. Nobles were also expected to administer justice, collect taxes, and manage the lands and people under their control. These responsibilities required a level of skill and judgment that was not easily acquired. The life of a monk or nun was also far from easy. Monastic life was governed by strict rules and routines. Monks and nuns were required to pray at regular intervals throughout the day and night, and to engage in manual labor. They were also expected to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. The physical demands of this lifestyle, combined with the mental and spiritual discipline it required, made it a challenging path to follow. So, in conclusion, life in the medieval period was not easy. No matter what your station in life, the work was hard, the hours were long, and the rewards were often meager. But despite these challenges, people found ways to survive and even to thrive. They developed skills and crafts that are still admired today. They built communities and institutions that have shaped the world we live in, and they left a legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us. As we lay here drifting into sleep, let us take a moment to appreciate the strength and resilience of our medieval ancestors. Their lives may have been hard, but they were also rich and meaningful in their own ways. As we journey back to medieval times, we find ourselves in the midst of a bustling town. The air is dense with the aroma of freshly baked bread, the sound of blacksmith hammers striking metal, and the hum of a busy market. Yet beneath this seemingly idyllic facade, a harsh reality lurked that dictated the rhythm of everyday life. Let's step into the shoes of a common peasant. As a serf, you would be part of the lowest social class, bound to the land and subject to the will of the local lord. Your day would start before sunrise as the likvam crowed, signaling the start of your labor. You'd likely live in a small, simple home made of wayul and dorb with a thatch roof, a far cry from the comforts of modern living. The home would be shared with your family and possibly some livestock, as animals were often brought inside for warmth and protection from thieves. Your diet would be far from varied or nutritious. You'd eat a lot of bread made from barley or rye, and perhaps supplemented by vegetables like beans and cabbages. Meat would be a rare luxury reserved for special occasions or the local lord's table. Instead, you might have a bit of cheese or a few eggs from your chickens. You would drink ale or mead, as water was often unsafe to drink. The work was backbreaking. You toil in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending to the livestock, and performing any other tasks the Lord required. The work was not only physically exhausting, but monotonous, leaving little time for leisure or personal growth. Education was a privilege reserved for the clergy and the nobility, so you'd most likely be illiterate, relying on the local priest for information about the world beyond your village. Healthcare care in medieval times was primitive at best. The prevailing theory was that of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. It was believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatments often involved bloodletting or purging without the knowledge of germs or proper sanitation. Disease spread quickly, and life expectancy was low. The church played a significant role in everyday life. Sundays and holy days were reserved for worship, and failing to attend Mass could result in punishment. The church was also the center of social life, where villagers gathered for festivals and fairs. However, the church also wielded significant power and could excommunicate anyone who violated its laws, effectively cutting them off from society. As a serf, you wouldn't have the freedom to choose your own destiny. You couldn't leave the land without permission from the Lord, and your children would inherit your status. The concept of upward mobility was virtually non-existent, and the idea of individual rights would not emerge for centuries. Despite these harsh realities, medieval times were not without their moments of joy and camaraderie. There were festivals and feasts, celebrations of the changing seasons, and the simple pleasure of a job well done. Music, dance, and storytelling were integral parts of the culture, providing respite from the hardships of everyday life. As we return to the present, it's clear that our lives are vastly different from those of our medieval ancestors. We enjoy comforts and freedoms they could hardly imagine. Yet, it's also worth remembering the resilience and determination of these people who lived and loved, worked, and played in a world so different from our own. Their stories remind us of the human capacity to adapt and endure, to find joy in the midst of hardship, and to create a sense of community and purpose, even in the most challenging circumstances. As we continue our journey through the daily life of a person in the medieval period, let's turn our attention to the aspect of health and medicine. If you were living in medieval times, you might find the healthcare system significantly different from what we know today. The understanding of disease, its causes and treatment, was extremely limited, and life expectancy was short due to various health problems. The knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary at best. The practice of dissecting human bodies to understand their workings was considered taboo and often illegal, leaving many physicians to guess at the inner workings of the human body. This lack of understanding led to many misconceptions and misdiagnosis. The belief in the four humors, black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, was prevalent. These were thought to be bodily fluids that needed to be in balance for a person to stay healthy. Any imbalance was considered the root cause of all diseases and illnesses. In terms of treatment, bloodletting was a common practice. The idea was to drain the body of excess bad humors. Leeches were often used for this purpose. In today's medical understanding, this practice is largely considered harmful and ineffective. But in medieval times, it was a widely accepted form of treatment, often leading to weakness and sometimes death due to loss of blood. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another factor that would make it hard for a modern person to survive. In medieval times, bathing was not a regular practice and was often considered an indulgence. The concept of germs and sanitation was not understood, leading to widespread diseases. The Black Death, a plague that wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, is a stark testament to this lack of sanitation and understanding of disease transmission. Medieval diet also played a significant role in the health of the people. The lower classes subsisted on a diet of mostly grain like barley and rye with little meat or fresh fruit and vegetables. This lack of a balanced diet often led to malnutrition, weakening the immune system and making people more susceptible to diseases. Dentistry, too, was a field in its infancy. Tooth decay was a common problem, often leading to dangerous infections. Without the understanding of dental hygiene and effective treatments, toothaches were often a lifelong issue for many. Childbirth was a particularly dangerous time for women. There was a lack of understanding about cleanliness and the need for our sterile environments during childbirth, leading to a high rate of maternal and infant mortality. Midwives, not formally trained physicians, usually attended births. Their knowledge was based on experience rather than formal education, leading to many complications and fatalities. Despite these challenges, there were some advancements in medicine. During the medieval period, the creation of universities in the 12th century led to the development of medical schools where knowledge was collected and taught. Monasteries served as places of healing, with monks often having knowledge of herbs and remedies. This period also saw the emergence of hospitals, though they were more places for the poor and the sick to go to die rather than institutions for healing and recovery as we know them today. In conclusion, health and medicine in the medieval period were fraught with challenges. The lack of understanding about the human body, disease, and hygiene made it a dangerous time to be alive. The treatments available were often ineffective and sometimes harmful. However, it was also a time of slow progress, with the foundations of modern medicine being laid. As we move to the final section of this journey, let's ponder on the resilience of the human spirit and the drive for survival that saw people through these challenging times. As we continue our peaceful journey through the heart of the medieval period, we find ourselves shifting our focus from the bustling life of the cities and castles to the quieter, but no less important rural countryside. Here, in the vast expanses of fields and forests, the majority of the medieval population made their living as farmers and laborers, their lives intimately tied to the rhythm of the seasons and the bounty of the earth. Life in a medieval village was far from the romanticized tales of chivalry and courtly love associated with this era. It was characterized by a simplicity and routine that for many modern individuals would be unbearably monotonous. The day for a medieval peasant would begin at dawn with the crowing of the roosters. After a simple breakfast, often consisting of bread, cheese, and weak ale, they would head out to the fields for a long day of labor. The agricultural practices of the medieval period were rudimentary by today's standards, without the benefit of modern machinery. Every task was performed by hand. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting were all physically demanding activities that required strength, endurance, and a great deal of patience. Despite their hard work, the yield from their labor was often meager. Poor soil quality, unpredictable. Weather and rampant crop diseases meant that failure and famine were constant threats. The diet of a medieval peasant was similarly austere. They subsisted primarily on a diet of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with occasional small amounts of cheese and meat. The monotony of their diet was occasionally broken by the availability of seasonal fruits, nuts, and berries. However, these were often preserved for the winter months when food was scarce. Health and hygiene were another area where the medieval period fell short by modern standards. Without understanding the principles of germ theory and sanitation, illness was rampant and often deadly. Child mortality rates were high and life expectancy was low. Common ailments like toothaches, colds, and digestive issues were often treated, with a mix of folk remedies and superstition. More serious illnesses like the plague could wipe out entire communities. Despite these hardships, the life of a medieval peasant was not without its small joys and comforts. The village was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, and social activities, like dances, feasts, and fairs, provided much-needed relief from the daily grind. The church, too, was a central part of village life, providing spiritual comfort and a sense of order in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. The medieval period was also a time of innovation and progress in many areas. Advances in technology, such as the heavy plow and the horse collar, made farming more efficient. The establishment of guilds and the development of trade routes helped stimulate economic growth. The construction of cathedrals, castles, and universities reflected the period's artistic and intellectual achievements. Yet, for all its progress, the medieval world was a place of profound inequality. The feudal system, which governed social and economic relations, was heavily weighted in favor of the nobility and the clergy. Peasants had few rights and little opportunity for social mobility. Their lives were defined by their labor, and their status was determined by their birth. Reflecting on the realities of life in the medieval period, it's easy to understand why we as modern individuals might find it difficult to last a day in this era. The physical demands, the lack of comfort, the constant uncertainty. These challenges would test even the most resilient among us. Yet there is also a certain beauty in this simplicity, a reminder of the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit. As we drift further into the tranquil embrace of sleep, let us carry with us this sense of gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of our modern life, and a newfound appreciation for the trials and triumphs of our medieval ancestors. As our journey through the annals of history continues, we find ourselves delving into an era of knights, castles, and feudal society, the medieval times. Picture yourself, if you will, transported back through the centuries, landing in a world far removed from the one we inhabit today. It's a time of stark contrasts, where the wealthy live in fortified castles while the poor toil in the fields. It's a time where the church wields immense power and one's fate is often dictated by the whims of their lord. As we begin to explore this fascinating era, we can start to understand why the comforts and conveniences we take for granted today would make it incredibly challenging for a contemporary person to survive a day in medieval times. Firstly, let's consider the living conditions. If you were a peasant, which was the most likely scenario given that the vast majority of people belong to the peasant class, your dwelling would be a small one-room cottage. This cottage, made of wily and daub, a mixture of mud, straw, and manure, would be shared with both your family and your animals. The floor would be strewn with straw and covered in animal dung, while the air would be thick with the smell of smoke from the central hearth. A far cry from our modern houses with separate rooms, indoor plumbing, and central heating. Then there is the matter of food. If you were a peasant, your diet would consist largely of pottage, a type of thick stew made from whatever vegetables were in season along with some grain, perhaps barley or oats. Meat would be a rare luxury, and fresh fruit and vegetables would be scarce during the long winter months. Fast food, convenience meals, and the abundance of food we enjoy today would be unimaginable in the medieval era. The daily routine would be grueling. As a peasant, you would be expected to work the fields from dawn until dusk, regardless of the weather. There would be little time for leisure or relaxation, and your duties would extend beyond farming to include tasks such as repairing the Lord's road or building his castle. This is a stark contrast to our modern work-life balance, where we have the luxury of weekends, holidays, and the ability to work from home. Health care, or rather the lack thereof, is another factor that would make survival in the medieval times challenging. Without our modern understanding of germs and disease, medieval doctors often resorted to dubious treatments, such as bloodletting and leech therapy. Add to this a lack of sanitation and the prevalence of diseases such as the plague, and it's clear that staying healthy in the medieval era would be a formidable task. In addition to these physical challenges, there would also be social and cultural obstacles to navigate. As a peasant, your life would be governed by the will of the Lord of the Manor. You could be called upon to fight in his wars, and your life would be subject to the whims of his justice. The concept of individual rights and freedoms which we take for granted today would be largely absent in the medieval era. And let's not forget about the influence of the church. In the medieval times, the church was not just a place of worship, but also a significant political and social institution. The church dictated moral standards, influenced laws, and even played a role in education. The concept of religious freedom, as we understand it today, would be alien in this context. Lastly, consider the lack of technological conveniences. Without electricity, there would be no lighting after sunset except for candles or oil lamps. There would be no telephones, no internet, no cars or trains, and certainly no smartphones or computers. Even simple tasks, such as washing clothes or preparing food, would be labor-intensive and time-consuming. In conclusion, while the medieval era is a fascinating period to study, it's clear that the harsh living conditions, the lack of modern conveniences, and the rigid social structures would make it incredibly difficult for a person from our time to survive a day in this era. But as we continue to delve deeper into this period, we'll gain a greater appreciation for the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors who not only survived but thrived in these challenging times. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, spare a thought for our medieval ancestors and take a moment to appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. And remember, history is not just about understanding the past, but also about gaining perspective on the present. Good night. As the early morning fog lifts slowly from the cobblestone streets, we find ourselves in a bustling medieval town center. The air is filled with noise, the clatter of horse hooves, the chatter of townsfolk, the hammering of blacksmiths, and the cry of street vendors. Life in the medieval times was far from quiet, a cacophony of sounds from dawn to dusk, a symphony of existence in an era that was anything but peaceful. If you were a serf, the lowest social class, your day would begin long before the sun rose. Serfs were bound to the land, effectively owned by the local lord. They had no rights and were forced to work long hours, often in the fields, tending to crops and livestock. Despite the backbreaking labor, serfs were not paid. Instead, they were given a small piece of land to grow their own food. Even children as young as 7 were expected to contribute, their small hands perfect for tasks such as pulling weeds or feeding chickens. The diet of a medieval serf was simple and monotonous. Breakfast, if you were fortunate enough to have it, might consist of a hunk of bread and a bit of cheese. Dinner, the main meal of the day, was typically a vegetable pottage, a thick soup made from whatever was available: cabbage, onions, leeks, and beans. Meat was a luxury, saved for special occasions, and the average serf only tasted it a few times a year. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was another challenge of medieval life. Baths were infrequent, with most people washing just their hands and face. This lack of personal hygiene, combined with unsanitary living conditions, led to a multitude of health problems. Fleas and lice were common, as were skin diseases and infections. It's no surprise that the average life expectancy was only around 30 years. Medieval towns were not only noisy and dirty, they were also dangerous places to live. Without a police force, crime was rampant, and punishment was harsh. Thieves could be publicly humiliated in the stocks, while more serious crimes could result in execution. Fire was another ever-present danger. Most buildings were made of wood and packed closely together, so a single spark could result in a devastating blaze. For the nobility, life was considerably more comfortable, but it had its own set of challenges. The noble class was expected to provide military service to the king, which often meant leaving home for months at a time. Women in the noble class had a little more freedom than their peasant counterparts, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage and produce heirs. Medieval life was a constant struggle for survival. From the backbreaking labor of serfs to the political maneuvering of nobility, everyone had their part to play in this complex societal structure. And yet, despite the hardships, people found joy in their lives. They celebrated with feasts and festivals, made beautiful works of art, and told stories that have been passed down through the ages. As we journey further into the medieval times, we'll delve deeper into the daily lives of the people, their beliefs, and their culture. We'll explore the role of the church, the rise of universities, and the flowering of literature and art. Despite the hardships, there's a lot to admire about this resilient society, which has left an indelible mark on our own. And as the twilight descends on our medieval town, we are left with a sense of awe and appreciation for the people who lived, loved, and survived in these challenging times. So, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the cobblestone streets, the bustling markets, and the grand castles of the medieval times. Picture the serfs tending to their fields, the nobility riding off to war, and the children playing in the streets. Despite the hardships, there's a beauty and resilience in this era that continues to captivate us centuries later. And as you drift off to sleep, let the sounds, sights, and stories of the medieval times lull you into peaceful dreams. As we delve deeper into the daily life of people in medieval times, one cannot overlook the crucial role of labor and work. Each morning as dawn broke, these serfs, who made up the majority of the population in medieval Europe, were roused from their slumber to begin their tasks. Their day usually started at the crack of dawn, often even before the sun had broken the horizon. The concept of a weekend did not exist, and the serfs toiled from dusk till dawn, 6 days a week, with only the Sabbath day off for religious observance. The labor was intense and grueling. Serfs were essentially peasants who worked on the Lord's land in exchange for protection. They cultivated fields, tended to animals, and performed any other tasks that the Lord deemed necessary. From sowing seeds in the fields to threshing the ice-harvested grain, every task was manual, often involving heavy lifting and strenuous physical activity. The tools were rudimentary, made from wood and iron, and required considerable strength and endurance to operate. A serf's life was not their own. Their existence was dictated by the demands of their lord and the seasons. Not only were the working conditions harsh, but the serfs also lived in a state of constant insecurity. As they had no rights or freedoms, they were at the complete mercy of their lords. They could be evicted from their homes, their meager possessions seized, or their families torn apart at the whim of their lord. In addition, they were obliged to pay crippling taxes and rents, often in the form of crops or labor. This chronic uncertainty and lack of control over their own lives made for a stressful existence. The diet of the medieval serf was as bland and monotonous as their life. Their meals predominantly consisted of dark bread made from rye or barley and pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally a small amount of meat. The meat was a luxury that was rarely afforded to them, reserved for special occasions or during the winter months. They drank ale or mead as water was often contaminated and unsafe to drink. Fruits and vegetables were part of their diet, but these were seasonal and not always readily available. The medical care during the medieval period was rudimentary at best. The knowledge of medicine was limited, and most treatments were based on superstition and folklore rather than science. Illnesses were often attributed to supernatural causes, and the remedies were equally bizarre. Bloodletting, for instance, was a common treatment for a variety of ailments. The idea was to balance the four humors of the body: blood, phlegm, black, bile, and yellow bile. By removing the excess blood, it was believed that the balance could be restored, thereby curing the disease. Needless to say, this often did more harm than good. In addition to the physical hardships, the mental strain was equally taxing. The life of a serf was monotonous and unchanging. With few opportunities for leisure or recreation, the Church provided some solace with its promise of a better life in the hereafter. The serfs clung to their faith, finding comfort in the rituals and ceremonies of the Church. The occasional feast days and holy days offered a respite from the drudgery of daily life and were eagerly anticipated. Life in a medieval city was not much better than in the countryside. The cities were crowded and filthy with narrow winding streets and inadequate sanitation. Disease was rampant and epidemics were common. The houses were small and cramped, often housing multiple families. The air was polluted with smoke from the many fireplaces and the stench from the open sewers. The daily grind of a craftsman in a city was not much different from that of a serf. He too worked from dawn till dusk 6 days a week. However, unlike serfs, craftsmen had the opportunity to improve their lot through skill and hard work. They could become masters of their craft, own their own shops, and even become wealthy. However, this was not easy and required years of apprenticeship and hard work. In conclusion, life in the medieval times was a constant struggle for survival. Whether you were a serf toiling in the fields or a craftsman plying your trade in a city, the daily grind was grueling. The harsh working conditions, poor diet, inadequate medical care, and constant insecurity made life in the medieval times extremely challenging, to say the least. One cannot help but feel a sense of relief and gratitude for the comforts and conveniences of modern life. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us take a moment to appreciate the hardships our ancestors endured and the progress we have made. Good night. In our journey through the Middle Ages, we've traversed the social hierarchy, the daily chores, the cuisine, and the challenges of health and hygiene. Now, let's turn our attention to another harsher aspect of medieval life, the justice system. In the Middle Ages, the concept of justice was very different from what we understand today. Modern legal systems are built on the principle of innocent until proven guilty, but in medieval times things were quite the opposite. The burden of proving innocence often fell on the accused, and failure to do so could result in severe punishment. Witch trials are perhaps the most infamous example of medieval justice, but they were by no means the only form of trial. Trial by combat, trial by ordeal, and compurgation were all methods employed, each one more terrifying than the last. Trial by combat, for example, was exactly as it sounds. The accused and the accuser would fight, and God would supposedly grant victory to the innocent party. It's not hard to imagine how this system could be easily manipulated by those with strength or fighting skill. Trial by ordeal was similarly gruesome. The accused would be subjected to a physically painful or dangerous task, such as carrying a hot iron for a certain distance or retrieving a stone from a pot of boiling water. If their wounds healed cleanly within a set time, they were considered innocent. If not, they were guilty. This method was based on the belief that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent, a notion that seems dangerously naive to us now. Compurgation, on the other hand, required the accused to swear an oath of innocence backed by a group of oath helpers who would vouch for their honesty. This method relied heavily on one's reputation within the community and could be easily skewed by personal bias. Punishments for crimes varied widely from fines to corporal punishment to death. The severity of the punishment often depended on the social status of the accused and the nature of the crime. For instance, a nobleman might be fined for a crime that would earn a peasant a whipping or worse. Beyond the legal system, violence was a common part of everyday life in the Middle Ages. Raids and skirmishes were frequent, and personal safety was far from guaranteed. The lack of a centralized police force meant that people had to take their safety into their own hands, often leading to brutal reprisals and cycles of violence. And then there were the wars. The Middle Ages were a time of near constant conflict. From the Crusades to the 100 Years' War, these wars were not only deadly but also incredibly disruptive to everyday life. They could lead to food shortages, displacement, and widespread destruction. In addition to these physical hardships, the psychological toll of living in such uncertain times cannot be understated. The constant threat of violence, the fear of accusation, and the general unpredictability of life would have been incredibly stressful. It's hard to imagine getting a good night's sleep under such conditions. Despite these hardships, people in the Middle Ages found ways to adapt and survive. They developed systems of mutual aid and protection, like guilds and confraternities. They sought solace in religion and found joy in festivals and feasts. But even so, it's clear that life in the Middle Ages was far from easy. The harsh realities of medieval justice, the ever-present threat of violence, and the psychological stress of living in such a time would be enough to challenge even the hardiest of souls. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we close this chapter, let's take a moment to appreciate the relative comfort and security of our modern lives. While we still face challenges and uncertainties, they pale in comparison to the trials of medieval times. So as you drift off to sleep, be grateful for the peace and safety of your own bed and for the progress that has been made over the centuries. Good night. In our exploration of life in the medieval times, we now come to the matter of law and order, a topic that further underscores why a modern individual might find survival difficult in this era. The legal system of the Middle Ages was quite different from the one we are familiar with today. Rather than being a unified codified structure, it was a patchwork of local laws and customs overlaid with the edicts of lords, kings, and the church. This system was often arbitrary and harsh, reflecting the harsh realities of medieval life. In many ways, the medieval legal system was a reflection of the feudal system that dominated the political landscape. Lords had wide-ranging powers over their vassals and serfs, including the right to administer justice and punish crimes. They often acted as judge, jury, and executioner, and their decisions could be influenced by personal biases or vendettas. Moreover, justice was often meted out in public spectacles designed to deter others from committing crimes, a far cry from our modern ideas of due process and the right to a fair trial. In addition to this, there were a number of punishments and penalties that could be imposed for various crimes, many of which were incredibly harsh by today's standards. For example, Thieves could be branded or mutilated, while murderers might be sentenced to death by hanging or beheading. Even lesser offenses, such as slander or defamation, could result in public humiliation or corporal punishment. And while we're on the topic of crime, let's not forget about the concept of trial by ordeal. This was a practice whereby the accused was subjected to a physically dangerous or painful test to determine their guilt or innocence. The idea was that God would intervene to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. For instance, in the ordeal of hot iron, the accused was made to carry a red-hot piece of iron. If their hand healed cleanly within a certain period of time, they were deemed innocent. If not, they were found guilty. The church also played a significant role in the medieval legal system. Ecclesiastical courts, which were run by the church, dealt with cases involving clergy members, as well as certain types of moral offenses. These courts followed their own set of rules, known as canon law, which was based on biblical teachings in the writings of church fathers. Penalties could range from excommunication to penance, such as fasting or making a pilgrimage. Yet despite its many flaws and harshness, the medieval legal system did have some redeeming qualities. For instance, it recognized the concept of sanctuary, which allowed criminals to seek refuge in a church and be protected from arrest. This offered a route to mercy and forgiveness in line with Christian teachings of the time. Moreover, the system also laid the groundwork for many of the legal principles and institutions that we take for granted today. For example, the Magna Carta, a landmark document signed in 1215, established the principle that the king was subject to the law, not above it. This marked a significant step towards the rule of law, a concept that is central to our modern legal system. So while the medieval legal system was undoubtedly harsh and unpredictable, it was also a product of its time, reflecting the social norms and religious beliefs of the period. And while most of us would undoubtedly struggle to navigate its complexities and deal with its brutalities, it's also worth remembering that it was part of a broader historical process, one that eventually led to the development of more fair and equitable systems of justice. It's a reminder that for all its brutality and unfairness, the past can also be a source of learning and growth. In our next section, we'll delve into the world of medieval warfare, another aspect of life in the Middle Ages that would certainly pose challenges for a modern individual. From the chivalrous knights and their code of honor to the large-scale battles and sieges, we'll explore the realities of combat in this era and the toll it took on those who lived through it. So, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander to these distant, tumultuous times, and remember that the struggles and hardships of the past have helped shape the world we live in today. As we delve deeper into the medieval period, it's important to remember that life in this era was not a romanticized adventure, often depicted in tales of knights and damsels. It was a time of hardship, constant work, and survival. Let's explore. Further, imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, not to the sound of a blaring alarm clock, but to the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of a church bell. Your bed would be a straw pallet shared with other family members for warmth. You would rise, rubbing sleep from your eyes, and start your day of strenuous labor. This would be your daily routine, 7 days a week. There were no weekends, holidays, or vacations in medieval times. The concept of leisure time was alien, and the day was strictly divided into periods of work, prayer, and sleep. Most people in medieval times were peasant farmers living in small rural communities. Their lives were governed by the seasons and the cycle of crops. Spring would be a time of plowing and planting. Summer was for tending the fields. Autumn was the harvest, and winter was a time of preparation for the next year. The work was backbreaking, done with simple tools that required great physical effort. Peasants would toil in the fields from dawn till dusk, with only a brief pause for a midday meal. Food was a constant preoccupation in medieval times as it determined survival. The diet was monotonous and consisted largely of dark coarse bread made from rye or barley. Peasants might supplement this with vegetables from their gardens such as beans, peas, onions, and cabbages. Meat was a luxury, usually only available on special occasions. It was a difficult life, but not without its moments of joy and celebration. Harvest time, for example, was a time of communal endeavor and shared happiness. Medieval towns were dirty, crowded, and noisy. The streets were narrow and unpaved, lined with wooden houses that were prone to fires. Sanitation was poor, with waste often thrown into the streets or into open pits. Diseases were common, with outbreaks of plague and other illnesses regularly decimating the population. Despite these challenges, towns were also vibrant places filled with a variety of trades and crafts. There were blacksmiths, bakers, tailor, carpenters, and many others, all contributing to the bustling economy of the town. In medieval times, the church was a central part of everyone's life. It provided a moral framework and a sense of community. It offered hope and solace in a harsh world with the promise of eternal life in heaven. The church controlled many aspects of daily life, including education. Most people were illiterate, and the few who could read and write were usually members of the clergy. Medieval medicine was a mixture of superstition, herbal remedies, and religious belief. Doctors were rare and expensive, so most people relied on the local wise woman or herbalist for treatment. Many diseases and injuries were beyond the understanding and capability of medieval medicine, leading to high rates of mortality. Warfare was a constant threat in medieval times. Knights and soldiers were highly trained in combat, but the majority of fighting men were ordinary peasants, called up to serve their lord in times of conflict. Battles were brutal and bloody affairs with no concept of human rights or the treatment of prisoners. Despite the hardships and dangers of medieval life, people found ways to enjoy themselves. There were festivals and feasts, dances and games. Music and storytelling were important parts of culture, offering an escape from the harsh realities of life. The medieval world was also a deeply spiritual one, with a strong belief in the supernatural. People believed in witches, fairies, and other magical beings, and these beliefs were often intertwined with religious ones. In conclusion, life in medieval times was tough and challenging. It was a world of hard work, simple pleasures, and constant dangers. But it was also a world of community, spirituality, and resilience. Despite all the hardships, people found ways to survive and even thrive. It's a testament to the human spirit that even in the harshest of times, people found ways to create beauty and meaning. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember the resilience and strength of our medieval ancestors, and let their stories inspire you. Now, we delve into the judicial system of the medieval era, a topic that always seems to intrigue the curious minds of historians and enthusiasts alike. It was a time where the rule of law was rather different from what we know today. The very concept of innocent until proven guilty was almost foreign, and the methods for determining guilt were quite frankly bizarre and sometimes brutal. In the absence of any advanced scientific methods to investigate a crime, medieval societies relied on superstition and divine intervention to dispense justice. The concept of trial by ordeal was widely used in these times. If an individual was accused of a crime, they had to undergo a physically challenging, sometimes life-threatening task to prove their innocence. The ordeal could involve carrying a red-hot iron bar, plunging a hand into boiling water, or even sinking or floating in a body of water. The latter based on the belief that water, being a holy substance, would reject a guilty person, causing them to float. The medieval judicial system also heavily relied on compurgation, a process where an accused person could swear an oath of innocence, backed up by a group of oath helpers. These individuals, usually friends, family, or community members, would essentially vouch for the accused's character. If the accused was able to assemble enough oath helpers, they could potentially be acquitted of the crime they were charged with. However, the reliability of such a system is questionable, as biases and personal relationships could easily influence the outcome. Feudal lords who had been given land by the king were often responsible for maintaining law and order within their territories. They held their own courts and meted out punishments as they saw fit. This could mean a lack of consistency in sentencing, with punishments varying greatly from one region to another, and the possibility of a lord's personal biases affecting the outcome. Punishments in the medieval era were usually severe in public, designed to deter potential criminals. The stocks, the pillory, and public floggings were common forms of punishment for minor offenses. For more serious crimes, the guilty were subjected to hanging, beheading, or being burned at the stake. Despite the harsh and often unpredictable nature of the medieval judicial system, there was an attempt to establish a more uniform system of law in the 12th century. This was the birth of the common law system, which is still the basis of the legal system in many English-speaking countries today. King Henry II of England played a crucial role in this development. He established a system of royal courts that traveled around the country, hearing cases and enforcing the same set of laws everywhere they went. This meant that the same laws and punishments applied to everyone regardless of where they lived, and it provided a much-needed consistency in the law. However, the common law system was far from perfect. It was still heavily influenced by the whims of the king or his appointed judges, and the concept of a fair trial as we understand it today was still far off. Nevertheless, it was a significant step towards the modern judicial system we are familiar with. Thus, we can see that living in medieval times was not for the faint-hearted. The societal norms, the harsh living conditions, and the brutal judicial system would have made everyday life a struggle. The uncertainty and unpredictability of the law, combined with the heavy reliance on superstition and divine intervention, would have added a constant sense of dread and fear. The medieval era was indeed a time of darkness and hardship, but it was also a time that laid the foundations for many aspects of our modern society. The development of the common law system, despite its flaws, was a crucial step towards the establishment of a fair and consistent judicial system. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, we can appreciate the comforts and conveniences of our modern lives. We can feel grateful for the progress we've made as a society and look forward to a future where justice is not determined by the heat of an iron bar or the depth of a body of water, but by the strength of evidence and the pursuit of truth. As the day in the life of a medieval person continues, the sun reaches its zenith, casting long, dark shadows across the cobblestone streets. The medieval town is at the height of its hustle and bustle as people go about their daily chores. The air is thick with the smell of livestock, firewood, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. The bakery itself is a hive of activity, with the baker's apprentices kneading dough, stoking the ovens, and the master baker overseeing it all. His practiced eye would scan each loaf, ensuring it meets the strict quality standards of the time. Bread was not just a staple food in medieval times. It was also used as a plate, known as a trencher. After the meal, the trencher, soaked with gravy and sauces, was consumed or given to the poor. Meanwhile, in the bustling marketplace, traders from far-off lands would sell their exotic wares. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, considered a luxury in medieval times, would be displayed in small, ornate boxes, their fragrant aroma tantalizing passers-by. Merchants would loudly advertise their goods, competing with each other to attract customers. The marketplace was also a place where news and gossip were exchanged, adding a social dimension to the commerce of the day. At the edge of the town, the local blacksmith would be hard at work. The rhythmic sound of his hammer striking metal would echo through the streets. The blacksmith's role was crucial in a medieval town. They made and repaired everything from horseshoes to weaponry, from tools to nails. The blacksmith was often a respected figure, not just for his essential skills, but also because he worked with fire and metal, elements that were thought to have mystical properties. For the children of the town, life was not all play and no work. Children as young as 7 would be expected to help their parents with tasks such as gathering firewood, taking care of animals, and helping in the fields. Yet they would also find time for games. Children in medieval times played a variety of games, many of which are still enjoyed today. Marbles, hopscotch, and tag were all popular pastimes. As the afternoon sun began its descent, the monotonous tolling of the church bell would call the townsfolk to prayer. The church was the heartbeat of a medieval town. Not only was it a place of worship, but also a community center where important decisions were made and disputes were settled. The clergy not only provided spiritual guidance, but also education, as the ability to read and write was limited to a privileged few. At the local castle, the lord and his lady would be involved in managing their estate. The lord was responsible for providing protection to his people and maintaining law and order. He would also have judicial duties, presiding over court cases brought before him. The lady of the castle had her own responsibilities, which included managing the household, supervising servants, and overseeing the preparation of meals. As the day drew to a close, the taverns would begin to fill with patrons seeking a reprieve from the day's work. Ale was the drink of choice, often safer to consume than water, which could be contaminated. Music, storytelling, and games of chance would provide entertainment as the townsfolk relaxed and socialized. As the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon, the town would slowly quieten down. Fires would be doused, doors would be bolted, and people would retire to their beds, ready to start another day in the medieval world. This is a glimpse into the life in medieval times, a period characterized by harsh realities, but also by a sense of community and shared values that shaped our world today. Thus, we come to the end of another day in our journey through the Middle Ages, a time of chivalry and hardship, of tradition and transformation. So, close your eyes and let the sounds of the past lull you into a peaceful slumber as we prepare to explore a new day in the life of a medieval villager in our next section. Good night, dear listener. As we continue our exploration of daily life in the medieval times, we now turn our attention to the often harsh and challenging living conditions. The comforts of modern life that we take for granted would be far from possible in the medieval era. In medieval times, most people lived in small rural villages. The houses were typically made of bowel and dorb, a mixture of sticks and mud. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. These humble dwellings provided some protection from the elements, but they were far from comfortable. There were no glass windows, only shutters that could be closed to keep out the cold. The floors were simply compacted earth, covered in straw to provide some insulation. Within these homes, families lived in close quarters. Privacy was a luxury. Few could afford. In most cases, the entire family would sleep in the same room, often in the same bed. Furniture was sparse, consisting of a table, perhaps a few benches or stools, and a chest for storing belongings. Life was dictated by the rhythms of nature. People rose with the sun and went to bed when it set. They ate what they could grow or raise themselves. The diet was predominantly plant-based with a heavy reliance on grains. Bread was the staple food, supplemented by vegetables, fruits, and occasionally meat. Medieval people had to be self-reliant. They made their own clothes, grew their own food, and built their own homes. They had to know how to care for animals, mend fences, and repair tools. Every member of the family had a role to play, from the youngest child to the oldest adult. Health care, as we understand it today, did not exist. people relied on a mixture of folk remedies, herbal medicines, and religious rituals to treat illness. Disease was a constant threat, made worse by poor sanitation and a lack of understanding about how diseases spread. Plagues and epidemics were common, and mortality rates were high. The concept of leisure time was also foreign to the medieval mind. Every waking hour was consumed by the struggle to survive. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no vacations. Entertainment was limited to occasional feasts or festivals, often linked to religious holidays. The role of religion was central to medieval life. The church was not just a place of worship, but also a community center, a school, and often the largest and most impressive building in the village. Religious rituals and observances punctuated the daily routine, providing a sense of structure and order amid the uncertainty of life. Despite these hardships, people in the medieval times found ways to endure and even to thrive. They formed close-knit communities, relying on each other for support and mutual aid. They developed skills and crafts that are still admired today, and they left us a rich cultural legacy in the form of literature, art, architecture, and music. Living in medieval times was undoubtedly challenging, but it was also a time of innovation and resilience, of community and faith, of strength and perseverance. It was a time that shaped our world in countless ways, and its influence can still be felt today. As we come to the end of our exploration of the medieval era, let us remember not just the hardships and challenges, but also the achievements and the enduring legacy of this fascinating period in history. As we drift off to sleep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we are the beneficiaries of centuries of human ingenuity and resilience, and that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Good night and sleep.